Chapter 6, Part 2 of the Assault on Mount Everest, 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors. The Highest Point, by George Mallory, Part 2. As the broken ledges we now followed presented no special difficulties, the party was able to explore more than one level in search of some place sufficiently flat and sufficiently commodious. The nature of the ground and the presence of cloud, though we were never thickly enveloped, prevented any sort of extensive view. Many suggestions were mooted and rejected. A considerable time elapsed, and still we had found no site that would serve. At about 2 p.m., Somerville and some porters shouted the news that one tent could be pitched in the place where they were. On the far side of a defined rib, slanting up to the ridge we had left, they had discovered some sort of platform. It was evident that work would be required to extend and prepare it for the tent, and they at once set about building a supporting wall and leveling the ground. It remained to find a place near at hand for the other tent. We could see no obvious shelf, but the constructional works undertaken by Somerville seemed to contain such a promising idea that Norton and I, in separate places, each started works of our own. Each of us very soon reached the same conclusion, that nothing could be done where he was. We moved away and tried again, but always with the same result. The ground was everywhere too steep and too insecure. One soon tires of heaving up big stones when no useful end is served. Eventually coming together, we resolved to agree on the least unlikely sites and make the best of it. We chose the foot of a long sloping slab. At all events, it was part of the mountain and would not budge, and there built up the ground below it with some fine stones we found to hand. Our tent was pitched at last with one side of the floor lying along the foot of the sloping slab, and the other half on the platform we had made. It was not a situation that promised for either of us a bountiful repose, for one would be obliged to lie along the slope, and the only check to his tendency to slip down would be the body of the other. However, there it was, a little tent making a gallant effort to hold itself proudly and well. Before we had concluded these operations, the porters had been sent down about 3 p.m., and kitchen had been instituted, and a meal was already being prepared. Presumably because their single tent would have to accommodate the 4 of us, ours was too far away. When we set ourselves down to eat and be warm, Somerville and Morshed had arranged the kitchen outside of it. Somerville had appointed himself chief in this department, and it remained only for the rest of us to offer menial service. But so great had been his energy and perseverance, sheltering the flame from the cold draught, and by every device encouraging the snow to melt, that almost all such offers were rejected. Like a famous pretender, I would have gladly been a scullion, but I was allowed only to open 1 or 2 tins and fill up a pot with snow. I have no recollection of what we ate. I remember only a hot and stimulating drink, Brand's essence or Bovril or something of the sort. We did not linger long over this meal. We wanted to go to bed still warm. Norton and I soon left the others in possession of their tent, and began to make our dispositions for the night. To the civilized man who gets into bed after the customary routine, tucks himself in, lays his bed on the pillow, and presently goes to sleep with no further worry, the dispositions in a climber's tent may seem to be strangely intricate. In the first place, he has to arrange about his boots. He looks forward to the time when he will have to start next morning, if possible with warm feet and in boots not altogether frozen stiff. He may choose to go to bed in his boots, not altogether approving the practice, and resolving that the habit shall not be allowed to grow upon him. If his feet are already warm when he turns in, it may be that he can do no better. His feet will probably keep warm in the sleeping bag if he wears his bed socks over his boots, and he will not have to endure the pains of pulling on and wearing frozen boots in the morning. At this camp I adopt a different plan. to wear moccasins instead of boots during the night and keep them on until the last minute before starting. But if one takes his boots off, where is he to keep them warm? Climbing boots are not good to cuddle, and in any case there will be no room for them with two now inside a double sleeping bag. My boots were happily accommodated in a rucksack, and I put them under my head for a pillow. It is not often that one uses the head for warming things, and no one would suspect one of a hot head. Nevertheless, my boots were kept warm enough and were scarcely frozen in the morning. It was all important, besides, to make ourselves really comfortable if we were to get to sleep, by making experiments in the disposition of limbs, adjusting the floor if possible, and arranging one's pillow at exactly the right level, which may be difficult, as the pillow should be high if one is to breathe easily at a great altitude. I had already found out exactly how to be comfortable before Norton was ready to share the accommodation. I remarked that in our double sleeping bag I found ample room for myself, but not much to spare. Norton's entrance was a grievous disturbance. It was doubtful for some time whether he would be able to enter, considering how long and slim he is. It is astonishing how much room he requires. We were so tightly pressed together that if either was to move, a corresponding maneuver was required of the other. I soon discovered, as the chief item of interest in the place where I lay, a certain boulder, obstinately immovable and excruciatingly sharp, which came up between my shoulder blades. How under these circumstances we achieved sleep, and I believe that both of us were sometimes unconscious in a sort of light, intermittent slumber, I cannot attempt to explain. Perhaps the fact that one was often breathless from the exhaustion of discomfort and was obliged to breathe deeply helped one to sleep, as deep breathing often will. Perhaps the necessity of lying still because it was so difficult to move was good for us in the end. Norton's case was worse than mine. One of his ears had been severely frostbitten on the way up. Only one side was available to lie on, and yet the blessed sleep we sometimes sigh for in easy beds at home visited him too. The party had suffered more than at first we realized from exposure in the wind on the way up. The damage to Norton's ear was not all. I noticed when my hands got warm in bed that 3 fingertips appeared to be badly bruised. The symptom could only point to one conclusion, and I soon made out how they had come to be frostbitten. At the time when the step cutting began, I had been wearing a pair of lined leather gloves, motor driver's gloves well suited to the occasion, and my hands had been so warm that I thought it safe to change the glove on my right hand for a woolen one, with which it was easier to grasp the axe. But wool is not a good protection against wind, and in grasping the axe, I must have partially stopped the circulation in those fingertips. The injury, though not serious, was inconvenient, and Morshed had felt the cold far more than I. It is still uncertain whether he had yet been frostbitten in toes and fingers, but though he made no complaints about them until much later, I have little doubt they were already touched, if not severely frozen. At all events, he had been badly chilled on the way up. He was obliged to lie down when we reached our camp and was evidently unwell. When all is said about our troubles and difficulties, the night, in spite of everything, was endurable. For distraction to pass the sleepless intervals engaging thoughts were not far to seek. We had still our plans for tomorrow. The climax was to come, and might we not get so high by such a time? Then might not the remaining hours be almost, even quite enough? Besides, we had accomplished something, and though the moments following achievement are occupied more often in looking forward than in looking back, we perhaps deliberately encourage in ourselves a certain complacency on the present occasion. We were able to feel some little satisfaction in the mere existence of this camp. The 2 small tents perched there on the vast mountainside of snowbound rocks and was actually higher, at 25,000 feet, than any climbing party had been before. Hang it all, we cooed. It's not so bad. The worst of it, in dimly conscious movements, was still the weather. The wind had dropped in the evening, as it often does, and nothing was to be deduced from that. But the hovering clouds had not cleared off, and the night was too warm. I'm not meaning that we complained of the warmth, but for fine weather we must have a cold night, and it was no colder here than we had often known it at Camp 3. Occasionally stars were visible during the night, but they shone with a feeble, watery light, and in the early morning we were listening to the musical patter of fine, granular snow on the roofs of our tents. A thick mist had come up all about us, and the stones outside were white with a growing pall of fresh snow. We were greatly surprised under these conditions when, at about 6:30 a.m., a perceptible break appeared in the clouds to the east of us, the weather quarter, and this good sign developed so hopefully that we were soon encouraged to expect a fair day. It was even more surprising, perhaps, that someone among us very quickly discovered his conscience. "I suppose," he said with a stifled yawn, in a tone that reminded one of Mr. Saltina rolling around in his costly bed, "it's about time we were getting up." No one dissented. How could one dissent? "I suppose we ought to be getting up," we grunted in return, and slowly we began to draw ourselves out from the tight warmth of those friendly bags. I do not propose to emphasize the various agonies of an early morning start or to catalogue all that may be found for fumbling fingers to do so, but one incident is worth recording. A second rucksack escaped us, slipping from the ledge where it was perched, and went bounding down the mountain. Its value, even Norton would agree, was greater than that of the first. It contained our provisions. Our breakfast was inside it. From the moment of its illusion I gave it up for lost. What could stop its fatal career? What did stop it, unless it were a miracle? Somehow or another it was hung up on a ledge 100 feet below. Morshed volunteered to go and get it. By slow degrees he dragged up the heavy load, and our precious stones were recovered intact. At 8 a.m. we were ready to start and roped up. Norton first, followed by myself, Morshed, and Somerville. This bald statement of fact may suggest a misleading picture. The reader may imagine the four of us like runners at the start of a race, greyhounds straining at the leash, with nerves on the stretch and muscles aching for the moment when they can be suddenly tight in strong endeavor. It was not like that. I suppose we all had the same feelings in various degrees, and even our slight exertions about the camp had shown us something of our physical state. In spite of the occasional sleep of exhaustion, it had been a long, restless night, scarcely less wearisome than the preceding day. We were tired no less than when we went to bed, and stiff from lying in cramped attitudes. I was clear about my own case. Struggling across with an awkward load from one tent to another, I had been forced to put the question, is it possible for me to go on? Judging from physical evidence, no. I hadn't the power to lift my weight repeatedly step after step. And yet from experience I know that I should go on for a time at all events. Something would set the machinery going, and somehow I should be able to keep it at work. And when the moment of starting came, I felt some little stir of excitement. If we were not going to experience the wild joy of living, the leaping from rock up to rock, on the other hand, this was not meant to be a sort of funeral procession. A certain keenness of anticipation is associated merely with tying the rope. We tied it on now partly for convenience, so that no one would be obliged to carry it on its back, but no less for its moral effect. A roped party is more closely united. The separate wills of individuals are joined into a stronger common will. Our roping up was the last act of preparation. We had got ourselves ready, lacing up our boots so as to be just tight enough, but not too tight, disposing puttees so that they would not slip down, attending to one small thing or another about our clothing for warmth and for comfort's sake, possibly even tightening a buckle or doing up a button simply for neatness, and not forgetting to arrange the few things we wanted to take with us, some in rucksacks, some near to hand in pockets. Two of us, Norton and I, as Somerville's photograph proves, appeared positively dainty. The word seems hardly applicable to Somerville himself, but at all events we were all ready. We felt ready. And when all these details of a preparation culminated in tying on the rope, we felt something more, derived from the many occasions in the past when readiness in mind and body contained the keen anticipation of strenuous delights. How quickly the physical facts of our case asserted their importance. We had only moved upwards a few steps when Morshed stopped. "I think I won't come with you any further," he said. "I know I should only keep you back." Considering his conditions on the previous day, I had not supposed Morshed would get very much higher, but this morning he had so made light of his troubles, and worn so cheerful a countenance, that we heard his statement now with surprise and anxiety. We understood very well the spirit of the remark. If Morshed said that, there could be no longer a question of his coming on, but we wondered whether one of us should not stay behind with him. However, he declared that he was not seriously unwell and was perfectly capable of looking after himself. Somerville's judgment as a doctor confirmed him, and it was decided he should remain in camp while we three went on without him. Our first object was to regain the crest of the North Ridge, not by retracing our steps to the point where we left it yesterday, but slanting up to meet it perhaps 800 feet above us. Ascent is possible almost everywhere on these broken slopes. A steeper pitch can usually be avoided, and the more difficult feats of climbing need not to be performed. In fact, the whole problem for the mountaineer is quite unlike that presented by the ridge of any great mountain in the Alps, which, if it is not definitely a snow ridge like that from the Dôme des Gouttes to the summit of Mont Blanc, which almost invariably present a sharper edge and a more broken crest. On the north ridge of Everest, one has the sensations rather of climbing the face than the ridge of a mountain, and it is best thought as a face climb, for one is actually on the north face, though at the edge of it. I can think of no exact parallel in the Alps. The nearest perhaps would be the easier parts of the Hornli ridge of the Matterhorn. If we were to imagine the stones to be fewer, larger, and more secure, Somerville's photographs will convey more to the trained eye of a mountaineer than any words of mine, and it will be readily understood that there was no question for us of gymnastic struggles and strong arm pulls, wedging ourselves in cracks and hanging on our fingertips. We should soon have been turned back by difficulties of that sort. We could allow ourselves nothing in the nature of a violent struggle. We must avoid any hasty movement. It would have exhausted us at once to proceed by rushing up a few steps at a time. We wanted to hit off just that mean pace which we could keep up without rapidly losing our strength, to proceed evenly with balanced movements, saving effort to keep our form, as oarsmen say, at the end of the race, remembering to step neatly and transfer the weight from one leg to the other by swinging the body rhythmically upwards. With the occasional help of the hands, we were able to keep going for spells of 20 or 30 minutes, before halting for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes to gather potential energy for pushing on again. Our whole power seemed to depend on the lungs. The air, such as it was inhaled through the mouth and expired again to some sort of tune in the unconscious mind, and the lungs beat time, as it were, for the feet. An effort of will was required, not so much to induce any movement of the limbs as to set the lungs to work and keep them working. So long as they were working evenly and well, the limbs would do their duty automatically. It seemed as though actuated by a hidden spring. I remember one rather longer halt. In spite of all my care, I found that one of my feet was painfully cold, and fearing frostbite, I took off my boot. Norton rubbed my foot warm. I had been wearing 4 thick socks, and now put back on this foot only 3. As it remained warm for the rest of the night, I have no doubt that the boot was previously too tight. Once again, I learned the futility of stopping the circulation by wearing 1 layer of wool too many. It was our intention naturally in setting out this day to reach the summit of Mount Everest, provided we were not stopped by a mountaineering difficulty, and that was unlikely. The fate of our expedition would depend on the two factors, time and speed. Of course, we might become too exhausted to go further before reaching our goal, but the consideration of speed really covers that case, for provided one were capable of moving his limbs at all, he would presumably be able to crawl a few steps only so slowly that there would be no point in doing so. From the outset we were short of time. We should have started 2 hours earlier. The weather prevented us. The fresh snow was an encumbrance, lying everywhere on the ledges from 4 inches to 8 inches deep. It must have made a difference, though not a large one. In any case, when we measured our rate of progress, it was not satisfactory, at most 400 feet an hour, not counting halts, and diminishing a little as we went up. It became clear that if we could go no further, and we couldn't without exhausting ourselves at once, we should still at best be struggling upwards after night had fallen again. We were prepared to leave it to braver men to climb Mount Everest by night. By agreeing to this arithmetical computation, we tacitly accepted defeat, and if we were not to reach the summit, what remained for us to do? None of us, I believe, cared much about any lower objective. We were not greatly interested then in the exact number of feet by which we should beat a record. It must be remembered that the mind is not easily interested under such conditions. The intelligence is gradually numbed as the supply of oxygen diminishes, and the body comes near to exhaustion. Looking back on my own mental processes as we approached 27,000 feet, I can find no traces of insanity, nothing completely illogical. Within a small compass I was able to reason, no doubts very slowly. But my reasoning was concerned only with one idea. Beyond its range I can recall no thought. The view, for instance, and as a rule I'm keen enough about the view, did not interest me. I was not taking notice. Wonderful as such an experience would be, I had not even the desire to look over the northeast ridge. I would have gladly got to the northeast shoulder as being the sort of place one ought to reach, but I had no strong desire to get there, and none at all for the wonder of being there. I dare say the others were more mentally alive than I, but when it came to deciding what we should do, we had no lively discussion. It seemed to me that we should get back to Moorshedde in time to take him down this day to Camp 4. There was some sense in this idea, and many mountaineers may think we were right to make it a first consideration, but the alternative of sleeping a second night at our highest camp and returning next day to Camp 3 was never mentioned. It may have been that we shrank unconsciously from another night in such discomfort, whether the thought was avoided in this way or simply was not born. Our minds were not behaving as we would wish them to behave. The idea of reaching Camp 4 with Moorshedde before dark, once it had been accepted, controlled us altogether. It was easy to calculate from our upward speed, supposing that we could treble this on the descent. At what time we ought to turn, we agreed to start down at 2:30 p.m., but we would maintain our rate of progress as best we could until that time approached. At 2:15 we completed the ascent of a steeper pitch, and found ourselves on the edge of an easier terrain, where the mountain slopes back toward the northeast shoulder. It was an obvious place for a halt. We were in need of food, and we lay against the rocks to spend the remaining 15 minutes before we should turn for the descent according to our bond. None of us was altogether cooked. We were careful not brought to a standstill, because our limbs would carry us no further. I should be very sorry to reach such a condition at this altitude, for one would not recover easily, and a man who cannot take care of himself on the descent will probably be the cause of disaster to his companions, who will have little enough strength remaining to help themselves and him. It is impossible to say how much further we might have gone. In the light of subsequent events, it would seem that the margin of strength to deal with an emergency was already small enough. I have little doubt that we could have struggled up, perhaps in 2 hours more, to the northeast shoulder, now little more than 400 feet above us. Whether we should, then, have been fit to conduct our descent in safety is another matter. End of Chapter 6, Part 2.
Chapter 6, Part 3 of The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors. The highest point. While we ate such food as we had with us, chiefly sugar in one form or another, chocolate, mint cake, or acid drops, and best of all, raisins and prunes, we now had leisure to look about us. The summit of Everest, or what appeared to be the summit, I doubt if we saw the ultimate tip, lying back along the northeast ridge, was not impressive, and we were too near up under this ridge to add anything to former observations as to the nature of its obstacles. The view was necessarily restricted when Everest itself hid so much country. But it was a pleasure to look westwards across the broad north face and down it towards the Rongbuk Glacier. It was satisfactory to notice that the North Peak, which, though perceptibly below us, had still held, so to speak, a place in our circle when we started in the morning, this same Changxi had now become a contemptible fellow beneath our notice. We saw his black plebeian head rising from the mists that filled all the valleys, so that there was nothing in all the world as we looked from northeast to northwest but the great twins Jiachung Kang and Chou Yo, and even these, though they regarded us still from a station of equality, were actually inferior. The lesser of them is 26,000 feet, and we could clearly afford to despise him. The greater Chou Yo we had to regard respectfully before we could be sure. His triangulated height is 26,870, whereas our aneroid was reading only 26,800. It seemed that we were looking over his head, but such appearances are deceptive, and we were glad to have the confirmation of the theodolite later proving that we had reached 26,985 feet, higher than Chou Yo by 100 feet and more. The beneficent superiority with which we now regarded the whole world except Mount Everest no doubt helped us to swallow our luncheon, or was it dinner? A difficult matter, for our tongues were hanging out after so much exercise of breathing. We had no chance of finding a trickle here, as one often may in the blessed Alps, and medical opinion, which knew all about what was good for us, frowned upon the notion of alcoholic stimulant for a climber in distress at a high altitude. And so, very naturally, when one of us, be of good cheer, my friend, I won't give you away, produced from his pocket a flask of brandy, each of us took a little nip. I am glad to relate that the result was excellent. It is logically certain, therefore, that the brandy contained no alcohol. The non-alcoholic brandy, then, no doubt by reason of what it lacked, had an important spiritual effect. It gave us just the mental fillip which we required to pull ourselves together for the descent. Happily inspired by our medical comfort, I announced that I would take the lead. Norton and I changed places on the rope. I optimistically supposed that I should find an easier way down by a continuous snow slope to the west of the ridge. Somerville, also moved by inspiration, suggested that he should remain behind to make a sketch and hurry down our tracks to catch us up later. He says that I found it difficult to understand that he would only require a few minutes, and that I replied irritably. I can hardly believe that my tone just then was anything but suave, but I have no doubt I was glad to have him with us to be our sheet anchor, and particularly so a little later, for we were in difficulties almost at once. We found more snow on this new line, as I had supposed, but it was not to our liking. It lay not on a continuous slope, but covering a series of slabs and only too ready to slide off. We were obliged to work back to the ridge itself and follow it down in our morning's tracks. At 4 p.m. we reached our camp, where Moorshead was waiting. He was feeling perfectly well, he reported, and ready to come down with us to Camp 4. After collecting a few of our possessions, which we did not wish to abandon to the uncertain future, we roped up once more to continue our descent. So far, our pace going down had been highly satisfactory. In the Alps, one usually expects to descend on easy ground twice as fast as one would go up. But we had divided our time of ascent by 4, and in an hour and a half had come down 2,000 feet. Under normal conditions, at lower altitudes, even this pace would be considered slow. It would not be an exceptionally fast pace for going up these slopes, and yet the image that stays in my memory is of a party coming down quite fast. It is evident that the whole standard of speed is altered. On the ascent, too, I had the sensation of moving about twice as fast as we actually were. I imagine that the whole of life was scaled down, as it were, that we were living both physically and mentally at half or less than half the normal rate. However that may be, we had now to descend only 2,000 feet to Camp 4, and with more than 3 hours daylight left, we supposed we should have no difficulty in reaching our tents before dark. Meditating after the event about the whole of our performance this day, I have often wondered how we should have appeared at various stages to an unfatigued and competent observer. No doubt he would have noted with some misgiving the gradually diminishing pace of the party as it crawled upwards, but he would have been satisfied, I think, that each man had control of his limbs and a sure balance, and as we were moving along together over ground where the rope will very easily be caught under the points of projecting rocks and thereby cause inconvenience and delay while it is unhitched, this observer, watching the rope, would have noticed that in fact it almost never was caught up. The party at all events were keeping their form to the extent of managing the rope as it ought to be managed. For a moment, when they were in difficulties after turning back, he might have thought them rather shaky. But even here they were able to pull themselves together and proceed with proper attention and care. Whether he would have noticed any difference when they started off again, I cannot say. A certain impetus of concentration, a gathering of mental and physical energy, a reserve called up from who knows where when they turned to face the descent, had perhaps spent its force, and though the party was a stage nearer to the end of the journey, it was also a stage nearer to exhaustion and to that state where carelessness so readily slips in unperceived. It may be supposed we were a degree less alert, all the more because we foresaw no difficulty. We had not exercised the imagination to figure difficulties on the descent, and we now came upon them unexpectedly. The fresh snow fallen during the night had so altered appearances that we could not be certain, as we traversed back towards the ridge again, that we were exactly following the line by which we had approached our camp the day before. My impression is that we went too low and missed it. We were soon working along broken ground above a broad snow slope. Fresh snow had to be cleared away alike from protruding rocks where we wished to put our feet and from the old snow where we must cut steps. It was not a difficult place and yet not easy, as the slope below us was dangerous and yet not very steep, not steep enough to be really alarming or specially to warn the climber that a slip may be fatal. It was an occasion when the need for care and attention was greater than obviously appeared, just the sort to catch a tired party off their guard. Perhaps the steps were cut too hastily, or in one way and another were taking small risks that we would not usually take. The whole party would not necessarily have been in grave danger because one man lost his footing, but we were unprepared. When the third man slipped, the last man was moving and was at once pulled off his balance. The second in the party, though he must have checked these two, could not hold them. In a moment, the three of them were slipping down and gathering speed on a slope where nothing would stop them until they reached the plateau of the East Rongbuk Glacier, 3,500 feet below. The leader, for some reason, had become anxious about the party a minute or two earlier, and though he too was moving when the slip occurred and could see nothing of what went on behind him, he was on the alert, Warned now by unusual sounds that something was wrong, he at once struck the pick of his axe into the snow and hitched the rope round the head of it. Standing securely, his position was good, and while holding the rope in his right hand beyond the hitch, he was able to press with the other on the shaft of the axe, his whole weight leaning towards the slope so as to hold the pick of the axe into the snow. Even so, it would be almost impossible to check the combined momentum of 3 men at once. In 99 cases out of 100, either the belay will give or the rope will break. In the still moment of suspense before the matter must be put to the test, nothing further could be done to prevent a disaster one way or the other. The rope suddenly tightened and tugged at the axe head. It gave a little as it gripped the metal like a hawser on a bollard. The pick did not budge. Then the rope came taut between the moving figures, and the rope showed what it was worth. From one of the bodies which had slid and now was stopped proceeded an utterance, not in the best taste, reproaching his fate, because he must now start going uphill again when he should have been descending. The danger had passed. The weight of 3 men had not come upon the rope with a single jerk. The 2 lengths between the 3 as they slipped down were presumably not stretched tight, and the second man had been checked directly below the leader before the other 2. Probably he also did something to check those below him, for he was partly held up by projecting rocks and almost at once recovered his footing. We were soon secure again on the mountainside, and, not the least surprising fact, no one had been hurt. I suppose we must all have felt rather shaken by an incident which came so near to being a catastrophe, but a party will not necessarily be less competent or climb worse on that account. At all events, we had received a warning and now proceeded with the utmost caution, moving one at a time over the snow-covered ledges. It was slow work. This little distance, which with fair conditions could easily be traversed in a quarter of an hour, must have taken us about 5 times as long. However, when we reached the ridge and again looked down the snow where we had come up the day before, though it was clear enough we must waste no time, we did not feel greatly pressed. Our old tracks were, of course, covered, and we looked about for a way to avoid this slope, but it seemed better to go down by the way we knew, and we were soon busy chipping steps. It was a grim necessity at this hour of the day. I felt one might almost have slipped down checking himself with the axe. We were distinctly tempted. But after all, we were not playing with this mountain. It might be playing with us. There was a clear risk, and we were not compelled to accept it. We must keep on slowly cutting our steps. The long toil was shared among us until the slope eased off and we had nothing more to fear. We looked down to the North Col below us. No difficulty could stop our descent. We had still an hour of daylight. After all, with ordinary good fortune, we should be back in our tents before dark. I had been aware for some time that Morshead, though he was going steadily and well, was more tired than the rest of us. His long halt at our high camp can have done him little good. He had not recovered. His strength had just served to keep him up where it was urgently necessary that he should preserve his balance, but it was now exhausted. He had quite come to the end of his resources, and at best he could move downwards a few steps at a time. It was difficult to see what could be done for him. There were places where we might sit down and rest, and we should be obliged not only to stop often for 2 or 3 minutes, but also to stay occasionally for perhaps 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour. Anything like a longer halt must be avoided if possible, as the air was already cold, and an exhausted man would be particularly sensitive. Probably a longer rest would not have helped him, and we proceeded as best we could, so as to avoid delay as much as possible. One of us, and it was usually Norton, gave Morshead the support of his shoulder and an arm round his waist, while I went first, to pick out exactly the most convenient line, and Somerville was our rear guard in any steeper place. So we crawled down the mountainside in the gathering darkness until, as I looked back from a few yards ahead, my companions were distinguishable only as vague forms silhouetted against the snow. There were long hours before us yet, and they would be hours of darkness. Occasionally, the flicker of lightning from distant clouds away to the west reminded us that the present calm might sometime be disturbed. Perhaps below on the Col, or it might be sooner, the old unfriendly wind would meet us once again. For the present, it was fortunate that the way was easy. The great thing was to keep on the snow, and we found that the edge of rocks by which we had come up, and where it was now so much more difficult to get along, could be avoided almost everywhere. With the same edge of stones to guide us, we could not miss our way, and were still stumbling on in the dark without a lantern when we reached the North Col. But we had a lantern with us, and a candle, too, in Somervell's rucksack, and we should now require a light. I was reminded once again of the most merciful circumstance, for the air was still so calm that even with matches of a Japanese brand, continually execrated among us, we had no difficulty in lighting our candle. 200 yards, or little more in a direct line, now separated us from our tents, with the promise of safety, repose, and warmth in our soft eiderdown bags. Looking back, I never can make out how we came to spend so long in reaching them. We had but to go along the broken saddle of snow and ice where our tracks lay, and then drop down to our camp on the shelf. But the tracks were concealed and not to be found. Crevasses lay under the snow waiting for us. With nothing to guide us, we must proceed cautiously, and once among the confusing shapes of white walls and terraces and monticules and corridors, it was the easiest thing in the world to lose our way. Somervell, who had covered the ground once each way more often than any of us, held the helm, so to speak, against a sea of conflicting opinions. Even he, now our leader, was not always right, and we had more than once to come back along our tracks and take a cast in another direction. To avoid the possible trouble or disaster of having two men at once in a crevasse, we were obliged to keep our intervals on the ropes, so that Morshead had now to take care of himself. Perhaps the lower altitude had already begun to tell, for he was stronger now, and came along much better than was to be expected. At length we reached a recognizable landmark, a cliff of ice about 15 feet high, where we had jumped down over a crevasse on our first visit here in order to avoid a disagreeable long step over another crevasse on an alternative route. I was very glad we had come this way rather than the other, for though, looking down at the dimly lit space of snow which was to receive us, I boggled a little at the idea of this leap. The landing place was sure to be soft, and it would be easy not to miss it. I think each of us was just a little relieved when he found himself safely down, and I dimly remember congratulating, not Morshead, but Longstaff. I had already transposed the names several times, and he now protested, but it made no difference, as I could remember no other. Longstaff became an idée fixe, and though the entity of Morshead remained unconfused, I did not, for instance, give him Longstaff's beard. He was fixedly Longstaff until the following morning. The agreeable change of finding ourselves together in that curious coign was hardly disturbed by Somervell's remark, "We're very near the end of our candle." We felt we were all very near the end of our journey, for we had dimly made out from the higher level we had just quitted the neat rank of our tents still standing on the shelf below and ready to welcome us. We had only to find the rope which had been fixed on the steep slope below us, and we should be at the end of our troubles. But the rope was deeply buried, and we searched in vain, dragging the snow with our picks along the edge of the fall. We were still searching when the last of our candle burnt out. In the end, we must do without the rope, and began the abrupt descent tentatively, dubiously, uncertain that we had hit off just the right place. The situation was decidedly disagreeable. Suddenly, someone among us hitched up the rope from under the snow. It may be imagined we were not slow to grasp it. The blessed security of feeling the frozen but helpful thing firmly in our hands. We positively made some sort of a noise. Unrecognizable, perhaps, it would have been to sober daylight beings who know how to produce the proper effect. But if a dim bat of the night were asked what this noise resembled, he might have indicated that distantly, but without mistake, it was like a cheer. A few minutes more, and then, at 11:30 p.m., and there on the good flat snow as we fumbled at the tent doors, then and there at last we began to say, "Thank God." Had we known what was yet in store for us, or rather what was not in store, we might have waited a little longer for so emphatic an exclamation. We were in need of food, and no solid food could be eaten until something had been done towards satisfying our thirst. It was not that one felt, at least I did not feel, a desire to drink, but the long effort of the lungs during the day in a rarefied atmosphere where evaporation is so rapid had deprived the body of moisture to such an extent that it was impossible to swallow, for instance, a ration biscuit. We must first melt snow and have water. But where were the cooking pots? We searched the tents without finding a trace of them. Presumably, the porters whom we had expected to find here had taken them down to Camp 3 in error. As we sat slowly unlacing our boots within the tents, it was impossible to believe in this last misfortune. We waited for a brainwave, but no way could be devised of melting the snow without a vessel. Still supperless, we wriggled into our sleeping bags, and then something happened in Norton's head. In his visions of all that was succulent and juicy and fit to be swallowed with ease and pleasure, there had suddenly appeared an ice cream. It was this that he now proposed to us. We had the means at hand to make ice creams, he said. A tin of strawberry jam was opened. Frozen ideal milk was hacked out of another. These two ingredients were mixed with snow, and it only remained to eat the compound. To my companions, this seemed an easy matter. Their appetite for strawberry cream ice was hardly nice to watch. I, too, managed to swallow down a little before the deadly sickliness of the stuff disgusted me. My gratitude to Norton was afterwards cooled by disagreeable sensations. In the last drowsy moments before complete forgetfulness, I was convulsed by shudderings which I was powerless to control. The muscles of my back seemed to be contracted with cramp, and, short of breath, I was repeatedly obliged to raise myself on my elbows and start again that solemn exercise of deep breathing as though the habit had become indispensable. The last stage of our descent to Camp 3 had still to be accomplished on the following morning of May 22nd. I imagined that a fresh man with old tracks to help him might cover the distance from Camp 4 in about an hour and a quarter. But no sign was left of our old tracks, and the snow was deeper here than higher up. Only in the harder substance below the fresh surface could new steps be cut wherever the slope was steep. And as we began to understand that the way would be long and toilsome, another thought occurred to us. Our sleeping bags at Camp 4 would now be required at Camp 3, and porters must be sent to fetch them. Our tracks, therefore, must be made safe for them. Half our labor was in hewing so fine a staircase that the porters would be able to go up and down unescorted without danger. The wearisome descent, which began at 6 a.m., continued far into the morning. The sun pierced the vapory mists, and the heat was immoderate now as the cold had been higher up. The fatigued party regarded the conventions until the first man reached the snow at the foot of the final ice slope. There, so far as I could understand, the van became possessed of the idea that it would be more companionable for all to finish together. I found myself deliberately pulled from my steps and slid about 80 feet down the ice until the pick of my axe pulled me up at the foot of the slope. I could have borne the ignominy of my involuntary glissade had I not found Finch at the foot of the slope, taking advantage of my situation with a Kodak. The presence of Finch was easily explained. Reinforcements had arrived at Camp 3 in our absence, and the transport had worked with such wonderful speed that the oxygen cylinders were already in action. Finch, whom we had last heard of in bed with dysentery at the base camp, had shown such energy that he was now testing the oxygen apparatus with Wakefield and Geoffrey Bruce. They were bound for the North Col with a party of porters, so the return of our sleeping bags was easily arranged. The lesser injustices of fate are hard to forgive, and we regretted labor that might have been left to others. However, Wakefield now took us in charge, and at noon we were at Camp 3 once more. Strutt and Morris had come out to meet us. Noel had stayed in camp, and like a tormentor waiting for his disarmed victim, there we found the movie camera and him winding the handle. However, our welcome in camp is a pleasing memory. The supply of tea was inexhaustible. Somervell confesses to having drunk 17 mugfuls. He can hardly have been so moderate. Morshead probably needed to drink more than any of us. He ascribed his exhaustion on the mountain to want of liquid, and medical opinion was inclined to agree with the suggestion. However that may be, the night's rest at a lower elevation had largely restored his strength, and Morshead arrived at Camp 3 no more fatigued to all appearances than the rest of us. But he bore the marks of his painful ordeal. His condition had made him a prey to the cold, and we only began to realize how badly he had been frostbitten as we sat in camp while Wakefield bound up the black swollen fingers. End of Chapter 6, Part 3. Recording by Marnes 007, Chicago.
Chapter 7 of the Assault on Mount Everest, 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Prajakta. The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors. The Attempt with Oxygen, by Captain George Finch. Chapter 7, The Second Attempt. With the departure of the last of our companions on March 27th, Crawford and I found ourselves left behind in Darjeeling, impatiently awaiting the arrival of the oxygen equipment from Calcutta. A week elapsed before we were able to set out for Kalimpong, where we picked up the oxygen stores on April 4th. On the evening of our second march out from Kalimpong, suspicious rattlings were heard in the cases containing the oxygen cylinders. On investigation, it transpired that they had been packed metal to metal, and the continual chafing caused by the rough mule transport had already resulted in considerable wear in the steel. This dangerous state of affairs, which, if not speedily remedied, would undoubtedly soon have led to the bursting of some of the cylinders, with consequent demoralization of our transport, let alone possible casualties, called for immediate attention. So, throughout the night of April 5 and 6, Crawford and I, aided by our porters, worked steadily at grommeting the cylinders with string and repacking them in such a manner as would render impossible any recurrence of the trouble. On April 8, in a snowstorm, we crossed the Jalepla, thence proceeding via the Chumbi Valley and Fari, we ultimately rejoined the main body of the expedition in Kampazong on the 13th. The rest of our journey across Tibet to the base camp has already been described elsewhere, but perhaps I may be permitted to give a few of my own impressions of the country and its inhabitants. In recollection, the strange land of Tibet stretches itself out before me in an endless succession of vast, dreary plains broken by chains of mountains that, in relation to the height of their surroundings, sink into the insignificance of hills. Arid and stony desert wastes, almost totally unblessed by the living green of vegetation, interminable tracts of sand that shift unceasingly under the restless feet of an ever hurrying, pitilessly cruel wind, bleak, barren, and unbeautiful of form, but fair and of indescribable appeal in the raiment of soft glowing rainbow hues with which distance, as in compensation, clothes all wide open spaces. Sunsets provided many a wondrous picture, while towards the south a glistening array of white-capped excrescences marked the main chain of the Himalaya. The honor of being the most poignant of my memories of Tibet, however, remains with the wind. It blew unceasingly, and its icy blasts invariably met one straight in the face. The pre-monsoon wind is westerly, the post-monsoon wind blows from the east. Our journey towards the base camp led us towards the west. Homeward bound, during the monsoon we travelled east. Both going and returning, therefore, we marched in the teeth of a wind that gnawed even at our weather-beaten, hardened skins, and was the most generous contributor in the quota of discomforts that Tibet meted out to us. And what of the dwellers in these inhospitable plains? Like all humankind, the Tibetans have their bad as well as their good points. The former are easily told. If one wishes to converse with a Tibetan, it is always advisable to stand on his windward side. A noble Tibetan once boasted that during his lifetime he had had two baths, one on the occasion of his birth, the other on the day of his marriage. Those of us honored by his presence found the statement difficult to believe. Apart from this rather penetrating drawback, the Tibetans are a most likable people, cheery, contented, good natured, and hardworking, slow to give a promise but punctilious to a degree in carrying it out, truthful and scrupulously honest. As testimony of this last mentioned trait, be it said that during the whole of our long wanderings through Tibet, when it was quite impossible to keep a strong guard over our many stores, we never lost so much as a single ration biscuit through theft. Old age is seldom met with. It is exceptional to see a Tibetan whose years number more than 55 or 60, presumably living in so severe a climate at an altitude of 14,000 feet or more above sea level, proves too great a strain upon the human heart. The priests or lamas, as they are called in Tibet, constitute the governing class. They represent the educated section of the community. The monasteries are the seats of learning and, as such, are well nigh all powerful. I regret to state that I did not like the priests as much as the laity. The reason is not far to seek. If you wish to hold converse with a Lama, it is advisable not only to stand on his windward side but also to take care that the wind is exceptionally strong. The Lamas do not marry. As two-fifths of the able-bodied population of Tibet lead a monastic life, it will be readily understood that the odor of sanctity is all-pervading. In other respects, the monks proved as attractive as their simpler countrymen. Inquisitive with the direct and pardonable inquisitiveness of children, they are nevertheless men of a distinctly high order of intelligence. Kindly, courteous, and appreciative of little attentions, They were always ready to lend assistance and to give information concerning their religion and the manners and customs of their country. These few of the more lasting of my impressions would be incomplete without mention of Tibetan music. On the assumption that whatever is beautiful, Tibetan music is beautiful. To the Tibetan, to the Western ear, it is elementary in the extreme and in point of view of sheer ugliness of sound, competes with the jarring, clashing squeaks, bangs and hoots of the jazz bands that were so fashionable at home at the time of our departure for India. On May 2nd, the day after our arrival at the base camp, Strutt, Norton and I were sent off by the General to reconnoitre for a suitable first camping site near the exit of the East Rongbuk Valley, gaining the latter by the so-called terrace route which leads over the tremendous moraines on the right bank of the main Rongbuk Glacier. We had no difficulty in finding on the right bank of the East Rongbuk stream, but a few hundred yards west of the end of the East Rongbuk Glacier, a favorable position for camp number 1. We returned that afternoon, descending down the snowed over and frozen up stream to the main Rongbuk Glacier, making our way thence to the base camp through the trough leading down between the glacier and the moraines. With this little exertion, my climbing activities ceased for the time being. Soon afterwards, I was beset by a troublesome stomach complaint which had already claimed as victims the majority of the other members of the expedition, and it was not until May 16 that I was sufficiently restored from the wearing effects of my illness to resume climbing. In spite of this, my time at the base camp was fully occupied. Frequent oxygen drills were held and all the oxygen stores overhauled and tested. Various members of the expedition were instructed in the use of Primus stoves. There were many small repairs of different natures to be done, and in my leisure moments I was kept busy with matters photographic. In addition, Mount Everest and the weather conditions prevalent thereon became objects of the keenest study and interest. The remark, "I suppose Mont Blanc would be absolutely dwarfed into insignificance by Mount Everest," has frequently been made to me in one form or another, and to my questioner's amazement, my answer has always been a decided no. As a matter of fact, Mont Blanc, as seen from the Brivon or Flige, excels in every way any view I have ever enjoyed of Mount Everest. It is true that I have seen the latter only from a tableland which is itself from 14,000 to 16,000 feet above sea level, and that I know nothing of the wonderful sight that Mount Everest probably presents to the observer from the southern Nepalese side. The grandeur of a mountain depends very largely upon the extent to which it is glaciated. Mont Blanc is nearly 16,000 feet high and its glaciers descend to within 4,000 feet of sea level, a vertical zone of 12,000 feet of perpetual ice and snow. Those glaciers of Mount Everest which flow north, and thus the only ones with which we are concerned, descend to a point about 16,500 feet above sea level, a vertical zone of 12,500 feet of perpetual ice and snow. Thus, it is evident that from the point of view of vertical extent of glaciation, there is little difference between the monarch of the Alps and the northern side of the highest summit in the world. From the point of view of beauty, there can be no comparison. Seen from one quarter, Mount Blanc rises in a series of snowy domes piled one against the other in ever increasing altitude to a massive yet beautifully proportioned and well balanced whole. From another side, we see great converging granite columns breathing the essence of noble purpose, proudly supporting and lifting aloft to the sun the gleaming, snowy capped splendor of summit dome. Another viewpoint, though revealing perhaps a less beautiful Mont Blanc, lacking much of the graceful symmetry and strong purposeful design of the other views, is redeemed by the fact that the observer is forced in so close to the mountain that the rattling din of stone falls and the loud crash of the ice avalanche are always in his ears. Mont Blanc asserts her authority with no uncertain voice. In the Mount Everest, as we of this expedition know it, revealed in the full glare of the tropical sun, all this is lacking. Symmetry and beauty cannot truthfully be read out of the ponderous, ungainly, ill proportioned lump which carries, as if by chance, on its western extremity a little carelessly truncated cone to serve as a summit. Avalanches are neither seen nor heard. Falling stones there are without doubt, but one is too far off to hear them. Yet Everest had her moments. Diffused with the borrowed glory of sunrise or sunset, and clad in a mantle of fresh snow, the harsh clumsiness of her form would be somewhat softened and concealed, bathed in the yellow-blue light of dawn, as yet unkissed by the sun, but whipped into wakefulness by a driving westerly wind that tore from head and shoulders the snowy veil which she had donned during the night, rendering it into long, spun out living streamers. No beholder could gainsay her beauty. Weather conditions naturally proved of the greatest interest. On consulting my diary, I find that during the period from May 1st to June 5th, there were 2 days when the weather was fine and settled, and that these 2 days succeeded snowstorms which had thickly powdered the mountain with fresh snow. On both days the sky was cloudless or nearly so, and judging from the absence of driven snow dust about the summit, Mount Everest appeared to be undisturbed by wind. Apart from these two occasions, however, the weather was never absolutely fine. Cloudless skies there were, but the great streamers of snow smoking away from the highest ridges of the mountain testified to the existence of the fierce and bitter wind against which a mountaineer would have to fight his way. On 4 occasions, there were periods of snowstorms lasting from but a single night to 3 days and 3 nights. On May 10, Mallory and Somerville set out for Camp 3 to make ready for a first attempt to climb Mount Everest. I had practically recovered from my stomach trouble and expected to be able to leave the base in the course of a day or two in order to follow up the first attempt with a second attack in which oxygen was to be used. Norton was to be my companion. Unfortunately, however, I suffered a relapse and stood Norton and Morshead left to join Mallory and Somerville, whereas I had to resign myself to several more days at the base. At length, on May 15, I was ready and eager to think about doing something. My climbing companions were Jeffrey Bruce and Lance Corporal Tejbir, the most promising of the Gurkhas. Wakefield was to accompany us as far as Camp 3 in order to give us a clean bill of health from there onwards. Leaving the base on 16th, we proceeded to Camp 1, where The following day was spent attending to our oxygen apparatus and transport arrangements. Soon after midday on the 18th, we arrived at Camp 2, where the greater part of the afternoon was devoted to giving Jeffrey Bruce, Tejbir, and several of the porters a lesson in the elements of mountaineering and of icecraft. On the 19th, we reached Camp 3, where we learned from Colonel Strutt that Mallory, Norton, Somervell, and Morset had gone up to the North Col in the morning. Jeffrey Bruce and I immediately set about overhauling our equipment, in particular our oxygen stores, and as we worked, we could see the first party making their way through the seracs and climbing the ice cliffs of the lofty depression of the North Col. The cylinders containing our oxygen were found to be in good condition, but the apparatus, through no fault of the makers, who had indeed done their work admirably, leaked very badly, and to get them into satisfactory working order, 4 days of hard toil with soldering iron, hacksaw, pliers, and all the other paraphernalia of a fitter's shop were necessary. Our workshop was in the open. The temperature played up and down round about 0° Fahrenheit, but inclined more to the negative side of that irrational scale. The masks from which the oxygen was to be breathed proved useless, but by tackling the problem with a little thought and much cheerfulness, a satisfactory substitute was eventually evolved, making it possible to use the oxygen apparatus in an efficient manner. Without this new mask, no real use could have been made of our oxygen supplies. Oxygen would have been misjudged as being useless, and the solution of the problem of climbing Mount Everest would have been as distant as ever. Preparatory to embarking on the climb itself, we went for several trial walks. One over to the Rapiola, a pass 21,000 feet high at the foot of the northeast ridge of Everest, from which we hoped to obtain views of the country to the south. But only part of the northeast ridge showed hazily through drifting mists. Towards the north and looking down the East Rongbuk Glacier, views were clearer, though partially obscured by rolling banks of cloud. Colonel Strutt and Dr. Wakefield, unoxygenated, accompanied us on this little expedition, and oxygen at once proved its value. So easily did Bruce and I outpace them. On May 22nd, acting on instructions from Colonel Strutt, Jeffrey Bruce, Wakefield, Tejbir, and I, with a number of porters, set out for the North Col to meet and afford any required assistance to the members of the first climbing party who were on their way down from the mountain. It was also our intention to bring stores up into the North Col as well as give the oxygen apparatus a final severe tryout prior to embarking upon an attack upon Mount Everest itself. We met the first climbing party just above the foot of the final steep slopes leading up to the North Col. They were more or less in the last stage of exhaustion, as indeed men who have done their best on such a mountain should be. After supplying them with what liquid nourishment was available and leaving Wakefield and two porters to see them back to Camp 3, we carried on up to the North Col. In the afternoon, we returned to Camp 3. There had been a considerable amount of step cutting, for fresh snow had fallen, compelling us to deviate from the usual route, but even so, oxygen had made a brief alpine ascent of what is otherwise a strenuous day's work. We took 3 hours up and 50 minutes down with 36 photographs taken en route. End of section 15.
Chapter 7, The Second Attempt, Part 2 of the Assault on Mount Everest, 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lisa Green. The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors. Chapter 7 by George Finch, Part 2. On May 24th, Captain Noel, Tejbir, Jeffrey Bruce, and I, all using oxygen, went up to the North Col, 23,000 feet. Bent on a determined attack, we camped there for the night. Morning broke fine and clear, though somewhat windy, and at 8 o'clock we set off up the long snow slopes leading toward the northeast shoulder of Mount Everest. 12 porters carrying oxygen cylinders, provisions for one day, and camping gear. An hour and a half later, Bruce, Tejbir, and I followed, and in spite of the fact that each bore a load of over 30 pounds, which was more than the average weight carried by the porters, we overtook them at a height of about 24,500 feet. They greeted our arrival with their usual cheery, broad grins, but no longer did they regard oxygen as a foolish man's whim. One and all appreciated the advantages of what they naively chose to call English air. Leaving them to follow, we went on, hoping to pitch our camp somewhere above 26,000 feet, but shortly after 1 o'clock the wind freshened up rather offensively, and it began to snow. Our altitude was 25,500 feet, some 500 feet below where we had hoped to camp, but we looked round immediately for a suitable camping site, as the porters had to return to the North Col that day, and persistence in proceeding further would have run them unjustifiably into danger. This I would under no circumstances do, for I felt responsible for these cheerful, smiling, willing men, who looked up to their leader and placed him in the complete trust of little children. As it was, the margin of safety secured by pitching camp where we did, instead of at a higher elevation, was none too wide, for before the last porter had departed downwards, the weather had become very threatening. A cheerful spot in which to find a space to pitch a tent it was not, but though I climbed a couple of 100 feet or so further up the ridge, nothing more suitable was to be found. Remembering that a wind is felt more severely on the windward side of a ridge than on the crest, a possible position to the west of the ridge was negatived in favor of one on the very backbone. The lee side was bare of any possible camping place within reasonable distance. Our porters arrived at 2 p.m., and at once all began to level off the little platform, where the tent was soon pitched, on the very edge of the tremendous precipices falling away to the east Rongbuk and main Rongbuk glaciers, over 4,000 feet below. Within 20 minutes, the porters were scurrying back down the broken, rocky ridge toward the snow slopes leading to the North Col, singing as they went snatches of their native hillside ditties. What splendid men! Having seen the last man safely off, I looked to the security of the guy ropes holding down the tent, and then joined Bruce and Tejbir inside. It was snowing hard. Tiny, minute spicules driven by the wind penetrated everywhere. It was bitterly cold, so we crawled into our sleeping bags and, gathering round us all available clothing, huddled up together as snugly as was possible. With the help of a solidified spirit, we melted snow and cooked a warm meal, which imparted some small measure of comfort to our chilled bodies. A really hot drink was not procurable, for the simple reason that at such an altitude water boils at so low a temperature that one can immerse the hand in it without fear of being scalded. Over a postprandial cigarette, Bruce and I discussed our prospects of success. Knowing that no man can put forth his best effort unless his confidence is an established fact, the trend of my contribution to the conversation was chiefly, "Of course, we shall get to the top." After sunset, the storm rose to a gale, a term I use deliberately. Terrific gusts tore at our tent with such ferocity that the ground sheet with its human burden was frequently lifted up off the ground. On these occasions, our combined efforts were needed to keep the tent down and prevent its being blown away. Although we had blocked up the very few small openings in the tent to the best of our powers, long before midnight we were all thickly covered in a fine frozen spindrift that somehow or other was blown in upon us, insinuating its way into sleeping bags and clothing, there to cause acute discomfort. Sleep was out of the question. We dared not relax our vigilance, for ever and again all our strength was needed to hold the tent down and to keep the flaps of the door, stripped of their fastenings by a gust that had caught us unawares, from being torn open. We fought for our lives, realizing that once the wind got our little shelter into its ruthless grip, it must inevitably be hurled, with us inside it, down onto the East Rongbuk Glacier, thousands of feet below. And what of my companions in the tent? To me, who had certainly passed his novitiate in the hardships of mountaineering, the situation was more than alarming. About Tejbir I had no concern. He placed complete confidence in his sahibs, and the ready grin never left his face. But it was Bruce's first experience of mountaineering, and how the ordeal would affect him I did not know. I might have spared myself all anxiety. Throughout the whole adventure, he bore himself in a manner that would have done credit to the finest of veteran mountaineers, and returned my confidence with a cheerfulness that rang too true to be counterfeit. By 1 o'clock on the morning of the 26th, the gale reached its maximum. The wild flapping of the canvas made a noise like that of machine-gun fire. So deafening was it that we could scarcely hear each other speak. Later, there came interludes of comparative lull, succeeded by bursts of storm more furious than ever. During such lulls, we took it in turn to go outside to tighten up the slackened guy ropes, and also succeeded in tying down the tent more firmly with our alpine rope. It was impossible to work in the open for more than 3 or 4 minutes at a stretch. So profound was the exhaustion induced by this brief exposure to the fierce cold wind. But the alpine rope taking some of the strain, we enjoyed a sense of security which, though probably only illusory, allowed us all a few sorely needed moments of rest. Dawn broke bleak and chill. The snow had ceased to fall, but the wind continued with unabated violence. Once more, we had to take it in turns to venture without and tighten up the guy ropes, and to try to build on the windward side of the tent a small wall of stones as an additional protection. The extreme exhaustion and chill produced in the body as a result of each of these little excursions were sufficient to indicate that, until the gale had spent itself, there could be no hope of either advance or retreat. As the weary morning hours dragged on, we believed we could detect a slackening off of the storm, and I was thankful, for I was beginning quietly to wonder how much longer human beings could stand the strain. We prepared another meal. The dancing flames of the spirit stove caused me anxiety bordering on anguish, lest the tent, a frail shelter between life and death, should catch fire. At noon, the storm once again regained its strength and rose to unsurpassed fury. A great hole was cut by a stone in one side of the tent, and our situation thus unexpectedly became more desperate than ever. But we carried on, making the best of our predicament until at 1 o'clock the wind dropped suddenly from a blustering gale to nothing more than a stiff breeze. Now was the opportunity for retreat to the safety of the North Col camp. But I wanted to hang on and try our climb on the following day. Very cautiously and tentatively, I broached my wish to Bruce, fearful lest the trying experience of the last 24 hours had undermined his keenness for further adventure. Once again, I may have spared myself all anxiety. He jumped at the idea, and when our new plans were communicated to Tejbir, the only effect upon him was to broaden his already expansive grin. It was a merry little party that gathered round to a scanty evening meal, cooked with the last of our fuel. The meal was meager, for the simple reason that we had catered for only 1 day's short rations, and we were now very much on starvation diet. We had hardly settled down for another night when, about 6 p.m., voices were heard outside. Our unexpected visitors were porters who, anxious as to our safety, had left the North Col that afternoon when the storm subsided. With them they brought thermos flasks of hot beef tea and tea provided by the thoughtful Noel. Having accepted these most gratefully, we sent the porters back without loss of time. The night began critically. We were exhausted by our previous experiences and through lack of sufficient food. Teshbir's grin had lost some of its expanse. On the face of Geoffrey Bruce, courageously cheerful as ever, was a strained, drawn expression that I did not like. Provoked perhaps by my labors outside the tent, a dead, numbing cold was creeping up my limb, a thing I had only once before felt, and to the seriousness of which I was fully alive. Something had to be done. Like an inspiration came the thought of trying the effect of oxygen. We hauled an apparatus and cylinders into the tent, and giving it the air of a joke, we took doses all around. Teshbir took his medicine reluctantly, but with relief. I saw his face brighten up. The effect on Bruce was visible in his rapid change of expression. A few minutes after the first deep breath, I felt the tingling sensation of returning life and warmth to my limbs. We connected up the apparatus in such a way that we could breathe a small quantity of oxygen throughout the night. The result was marvelous. We slept well and warmly. Whenever the tube delivering the gas fell out of Bruce's mouth as he slept, I could see him stir uneasily in the uric greenish light of the moon as it filtered through the canvas. Then, half unconsciously replacing the tube, he would once more fall into a peaceful slumber. There is little doubt that it was the use of oxygen which saved our lives during this second night in our high camp. Before daybreak, we were up and proceeded to make ready for our climb. Putting on our boots was a struggle. Mine I had taken to bed with me, and a quarter of an hour's striving and tugging sufficed to get them on. But Bruce's and Teshbir's were frozen solid, and it took them more than an hour to mold them into shape by holding them over lighted candles. Shortly after 6, we assembled outside. Some little delay was incurred in arranging the rope and our loads, but at length, at 6:30 a.m., soon after the first rays of the sun struck the tent, we shouldered our bundles and set off. What with cameras, thermos bottles, and oxygen apparatus, Bruce and I each carried well over 40 pounds. Teshbir, with 2 extra cylinders of oxygen, shouldered a burden of about 50 pounds. Our scheme of attack was to take Teshbir with us as far as the northeast shoulder, there to relieve him of his load and send him back. The weather was clear. The only clouds seemed so far off as to presage no evil, and the breeze, though intensely cold, was bearable. But it soon freshened up, and before we had gone more than a few hundred feet, the cold began to have its effect on Teshbir's sturdy constitution, and he showed signs of wavering. Bruce's eloquent flow of Gurumukhi, however, managed to boost him up to the altitude of 26,000 feet. There he collapsed entirely, sinking face downwards on the rocks and crushing beneath him the delicate instruments of his oxygen apparatus. I stormed at him for thus maltreating it, while Bruce exhorted him for the honor of his regimen to struggle on. But it was all in vain. Teshbir had done his best, and he has every right to be proud of the fact that he has climbed to a far greater height than any other native. We pulled him off his apparatus, and relieving him of some cylinders, cheered him up sufficiently to start him with enough oxygen on his way back to the high camp, there to await our return. We had no compunction about letting him go alone, for the ground was easy and he could not lose his way, the tent being in full view below. After seeing him safely off and making good progress, we loaded up Teshbir's cylinders, and in view of the easy nature of the climbing, mutually agreed to dispense with the rope and thus enable ourselves to proceed more rapidly. Climbing not very steep and quite easy rocks, and passing 2 almost level places affording ample room for some future high camp, we gained an altitude of 26,500 feet. By this time, however, the wind, which had been steadily rising, had acquired such force that I considered it necessary to leave the ridge and continue our ascent by traversing out across the great northern face of Mount Everest, hoping by doing so to find more shelter from the icy blasts. It was not easy to come to this decision, because I saw that between us and the shoulder the climbing was all plain sailing and presented no outstanding difficulty. Leaving the ridge, we began to work out into the face. For the first few yards the going was sufficiently straightforward, but presently the general angle became much steeper, and our trials were accentuated by the fact that the stratification of the rocks was such that they shelved outward and downward, making the securing of adequate footholds difficult. We did not rope, however. I knew that the longer we remained unroped, the more time we would save, a consideration of vital importance. But as I led out over these steeply sloping, evilly smooth slabs, I carefully watched Bruce to see how he would tackle the formidable task with which he was confronted on this, his first mountaineering expedition. He did his work splendidly and followed steadily and confidently as if he were quite an old hand at the game. Sometimes the slabs gave place to snow, treacherous, powdery stuff with a thin, hard, deceptive crust that gave the appearance of compactness. Little reliance could be placed upon it, and it had to be treated with great care. Sometimes we found ourselves crossing steep slopes of scree that yielded and shifted downwards with every tread. Very occasionally, in the midst of our exacting work, we were forced to indulge in a brief rest in order to replace an empty cylinder of oxygen by a full one. The empty ones were thrown away, and as each bumped its way over the precipice, and the good steel clanged like a church bell at each impact, we laughed aloud at the thought that, there goes another 5 pounds off our backs. Since leaving the ridge, we had not made much height, although we seemed to be getting so near our goal. Now and then we consulted the aneroid barometer, and its readings encouraged us on. 27,000 feet. Then we gave up traversing and began to climb diagonally upwards toward a point in this lofty northeast ridge, midway between the shoulder and the summit. Soon afterwards, an accident put Bruce's oxygen apparatus out of action. He was some 20 feet below me, but struggled gallantly upwards as I went to meet him, and after connecting him onto my apparatus and so renewing his supply of oxygen, we soon traced the trouble and effected a satisfactory repair. The barometer here recorded a height of 27,300 feet. The highest mountain visible was Choi Oyu, which is just short of 27,000 feet. We were well above it and could look across it into the dense clouds beyond. The great west peak of Everest, one of the most beautiful sights to be seen from down in the Rongbuk Valley, was hidden, but we knew that our standpoint was nearly 2,000 feet above it. Everest itself was the only mountaintop which we could see without turning our gaze downward. We could look across into clouds which lay at some undefined distance behind the northeast shoulder, a clear indication that we were only a little, if any, below its level. Pumori, an imposing icebound pyramid, 23,000 feet high, I sought at first in vain. So far were we above it that it had sunk into an insignificant little ice bump by the side of the Rongbuk Glacier. Most of the other landmarks were blotted out by masses of ominous yellow-hued clouds swept from the west in the wake of an angry storm wind. The point we reached is unmistakable even from afar. We were standing on a little rocky ledge just inside an inverted V of snow, immediately below the great belt of reddish-yellow rock which cleaves its way almost horizontally through the otherwise greenish-black slabs of the mountain. Though 1,700 feet below, we were well within a half-mile of the summit, so close indeed that we could distinguish individual stones on a little patch of scree lying just beneath the highest point. Ours were truly the tortures of Tantalus, for, weak from hunger and exhausted by that nightmare struggle for life in our high camp, we were in no fit condition to proceed. Indeed, I knew that if we were to persist in climbing on, even if only for another 500 feet, we should not both get back alive. The decision to retreat once taken, no time was lost, and fearing lest another accidental interruption in the oxygen supply might lead to a slip-up on the part of either one of us, we roped together. It was midday. At first we returned in our tracks, but later found better going by aiming to strike the ridge between the northeast shoulder and the North Col at a point above where we had left it in the morning. Progress was more rapid, though great caution was still necessary. Shortly after 2 p.m., we struck the ridge and there reduced our burdens to a minimum by dumping 4 oxygen cylinders. The place will be easily recognized by future explorers. Those 4 cylinders are perched against a rock at the head of the one and only large snow-filled couloir running right up from the head of the East Rongbuk Glacier to the ridge. The clear weather was gone. We plunged down the easy broken rocks through thick mist driven past us from the west by a violent wind. For one small mercy we were thankful. No snow fell. We reached our high camp in barely half an hour, and such are the vagaries of Everest moods that in this short time the wind had practically dropped. Tedgebeer lay snugly wrapped up in all 3 sleeping bags, sleeping the deep sleep of exhaustion. Hearing the voices of the porters on their way up to bring down our kit, we woke him up, telling him to await their arrival and to go down with them. Bruce and I then proceeded on our way, met the ascending porters, and passed on, greatly cheered by their bright welcomes and encouraging smiles. But the long descent, coming as it did on top of a hard day's work, soon began to find out our weakness. We were deplorably tired and could no longer move ahead with our accustomed vigor. Knees did not always bend and unbend as required. At times they gave way altogether and forced us, staggering, to sit down. But eventually we reached the broken snows of the North Col and arrived in camp there at 4 p.m. A craving for food, to the lack of which our weakness was mainly due, was all that animated us. Hot tea and a tin of spaghetti were soon forthcoming, and even this little nourishment refreshed us and renewed our strength to such an extent that 3/4 of an hour later we were ready to set off for Camp 3. An invaluable addition to our little party was Captain Noel, the indefatigable photographer of the expedition, who had already spent 4 days and 3 nights on the North Col. He formed our rear guard and nursed us safely down the steep snow and ice slopes onto the almost level basin of the glacier below. Before 5:30 p.m., only 40 minutes after leaving the Col, we reached Camp 3. Since midday from our highest point, we had descended over 6,000 feet, but we were quite finished. That evening we dined well. 4 whole quails, truffled in pâté de foie gras, followed by 9 sausages, left me asking for more. The last I remember of that long day was going to sleep, warm in the depths of our wonderful sleeping bag, with the remains of a tin of toffee tucked away in the crook of my elbow. Next morning showed that Bruce's feet were sorely frostbitten. I had practically escaped, but the cold had penetrated the half-inch thick soles of my boots, and 3 pairs of heavy woolen socks and 4 small patches of frostbite hampered me at first in my efforts to walk. Bruce was piled onto a sledge, and I journeyed with him as his fellow passenger. Willing porters dragged us down until the surface of the glacier became so rough as to impose too great a strain on our slender conveyance with its double burden. Our attack upon Mount Everest had failed. The great mountain, with its formidable array of defensive weapons, had won. But if the body had suffered, the spirit was still whole. Reaching a point whence we obtained our last close view of the great unconquered goddess mother of the snows, Geoffrey Bruce bade his somewhat irreverent adieu with, "Just you wait, old thing, you'll be for it soon," words that still are expressive of my own sentiments. End of Chapter 7, Part 2. Recording by Lisa Green.
Chapter 8 of The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors. Conclusions by George Finch. Geoffrey Bruce and I arrived back at the base camp early on the afternoon of May 29. The next few days were spent in resting, and I then underwent the same experience as the members of the first climbing party. That is, instead of recovering my strength rapidly during the first 3 or 4 days, if anything, a further decline took place. However, as the weather appeared fine, and there seemed promise of a bright spell prior to the breaking of the monsoon, it was decided to make another attempt on the mountain. Of the remaining climbing members of the expedition, Somervell was undoubtedly the fittest, with Mallory a good second. Both had enjoyed some 10 days' rest since their first assault upon Mount Everest, and therefore had a chance of recovering from the abnormal strain to which they had been submitted. Medical opinion as to my condition after so brief a rest was somewhat divided, but in the end I was passed as sufficiently fit to join in the 3rd attempt. On the 3rd of June we left the base camp. The party consisted of Wakefield as M.O.,
Crawford and later Morris as transport officers, Mallory, Somervell, and myself as climbers. The attempt was to be made with oxygen, and I was placed in command. It required a great effort for me to get as far as Camp 1, and I realized there that the few days' rest which I had enjoyed at the base camp had been quite insufficient to allow of my recuperation. During the night the weather turned with a vengeance, and it snowed heavily, and I knew that there could be no object in my proceeding farther. After giving Somervell final detailed instructions regarding the oxygen apparatus, I wished them all the best of luck, and on the 4th returned to the base camp. As Strutt, Longstaff, and Morshead were leaving next day for Darjeeling, I was given and availed myself of the opportunity of accompanying them. That return journey constitutes one of the most delightful experiences of my life. Within a week of leaving the base camp I had entirely regained my strength, although a certain tenderness in the soles of my feet made itself felt for some considerable time. For the most part the weather was warm, and everywhere the eye feasted on the riotous coloring of blossoms such as we had never before seen. The only fly in the ointment was the ever-present sense of defeat, coupled with the knowledge that with only a little better luck we should have won through. In spite of our failure, however, I felt that we had learnt much; and perhaps the most important lesson of all was that we had been taught the real value of oxygen. Prior to the formation of the 1922 expedition, the oxygen problem had already been the subject of much discussion round which two distinct schools of thought had arisen. The first, headed by Professor G. Dreyer, F.R.S., Professor of Pathology at the University of Oxford, was staunch to the belief that, without the assistance of a supply of oxygen carried in containers on the back of the climber, it would be impossible for a man to reach the summit of Mount Everest. The second body of scientific opinion held that, not only would it be possible for a man to attain the summit of Everest unaided by an artificial supply of oxygen, but that the weight of such a supply would only hamper the climber in his efforts, and thus completely counterbalance any advantages likely to accrue from its use. To arrive at an impartial conclusion as to the correctitude of these two divergent opinions, it is only necessary to give careful consideration to the results achieved on the two high climbs of May 22 and May 27 respectively. The former was made without an artificial supply of oxygen, the latter with. The first climbing party, consisting of Mallory, Morshead, Norton, and Somervell, left the North Col at 7 a.m. on the 20th of May, and that afternoon, at an altitude of 25,000 feet above sea level, pitched a camp just off the great north ridge leading down from the shoulder. Morshead had suffered from the cold and was evidently unwell. One of Norton's ears had been badly frostbitten, and Mallory had frostbitten fingertips. Somervell alone was, to all intents and purposes, as yet untouched. Snow fell during the night, but they were untroubled by wind. At 8 o'clock next morning they left their camp, all save Morshead, who, apparently at the end of his tether and unable to go farther, had to remain behind. After over 6 hours climbing, Mallory, Norton, and Somervell succeeded in reaching an altitude of 26,985 feet, so that, since their departure from their high camp, they had gained a vertical height of 1,985 feet at a rate of ascent of 330 feet per hour. The point at which they turned back lies below the shoulder of the great north ridge, and is, in horizontal distance, about 1 1/8 miles from the summit, and rather over 2,000 feet below it in vertical height. They began to retrace their steps at 2:30 in the afternoon, and regained their high camp at 4 o'clock. Their rate of descent, therefore, was 1,320 feet per hour. Shortly after 4 p.m., accompanied by Morshead, they started on the return journey to the North Col, where they arrived at 11:30 that night, a rate of descent of 270 feet per hour. We had seen them on their way down from their high camp, and acting on instructions from Colonel Strutt, we went up towards the North Col on the 23rd to render them assistance. We met them just above the foot of the steep slopes leading up the col. They were obviously in the last stages of exhaustion, as indeed men should be who had done their best on a mountain like Mount Everest. On the 25th of May, the second party, consisting of Geoffrey Bruce, Teichbier, and myself, left the North Col. Our porters, who did not use oxygen, left at 8 o'clock. We, using oxygen, left at 9:30 a.m., and in an hour and a half succeeded in overtaking them at an altitude of 24,500 feet, where, somewhat fatigued with their 3 hours' effort, they paused to rest. A moment's calculation will show that we had been climbing at the rate of 1,000 feet per hour. Leaving the porters to follow, we eventually gained an altitude of 25,500 feet, where, owing to bad weather, we were constrained to camp. It was not until 2 o'clock in the afternoon that the porters rejoined us, despite the fact that our own progress had been hindered by the necessity for much step cutting. That night in our high camp was a night of trial and no rest, and the following day, the 26th, was little better. In addition, our supply of food was exhausted. Then followed a second night, when the advantages of using oxygen to combat fierce cold were strikingly evident. At 6 o'clock on the morning of the 27th, having had practically no rest for 2 nights and a day, half starved and suffering acutely from hunger, we set out from our high camp in full hopes of gaining the summit of Mount Everest. Half an hour later, at an altitude of 26,000 feet, Teichbier broke down, an unfortunate occurrence that may be largely attributed to his lack of really wind-proof clothing. On arriving at a height of 26,500 feet, we were forced to leave the ridge, so violent and penetratingly cold was the wind to which we were exposed. The 1,000 feet from our camp up to this point had occupied 1½ hours, some 20 minutes of which had been employed in rearranging the loads when Teichbier broke down. Our rate of progress, therefore, had been about 900 feet per hour, in spite of the fact that we each carried a load of over 40 pounds. After leaving the ridge, we struck out over difficult ground across the great north face of the mountain, gaining but little in altitude, but steadily approaching our goal. Eventually we decided to turn back at a point less than half a mile in horizontal distance from, and about 1,700 feet below, the summit. Thus, although we had climbed in vertical height only some 300 feet higher than the first party, nevertheless we were more than twice as close to the summit than they had been when they turned back. To summarize the two performances. The first party established a camp at an altitude of 25,000 feet, occupied it for 1 night, and finally reaching a point 26,985 feet in height, and 1 1/8 miles from the summit, returned without a break to the North Col. The second party established a camp at an altitude of 25,500 feet, occupied it for 2 nights and almost 2 days, and eventually reaching a point of 27,300 feet high and less than ½ a mile from the summit, returned without a break to Camp 3. The weather conditions throughout were incomparably worse than those experienced by the first party. The difference between the two performances cannot be ascribed to superior climbing powers on the part of the second party, for the simple reason that all the members of the first party were skilled and proven mountaineers, while Geoffrey Bruce and Lance Corporal Teichbier, though at home in the hills, had never before set foot on a snow and ice mountain. No matter how strong and willing and gallant an inexperienced climber may be, his lack of mountaineering skill and knowledge inevitably results in that prodigality of effort, much of it needless, which invariably and quickly places him at a grave disadvantage when compared with the trained mountaineer. The strength of a climbing party is no greater than that of its weakest member. Judged on this basis, the second party was very weak compared with the first, and the superior results obtained by the former can only be ascribed to the fact that they made use of an artificial supply of oxygen. The contention, therefore, that the disadvantages of its weight would more than counterbalance the advantages of an artificial supply of oxygen may be dismissed as groundless, and the assumption may be made that on any further attempt upon Everest, oxygen will form a most important part of the climber's equipment. The question next arises as to the exact stage in the proceedings at which recourse should be made to the assistance of oxygen. The strongest members of the expedition felt fit and well, and recuperated readily from fatigue at Camp 3, 21,000 feet above sea level, but at the North Col this was no longer the case. Thus it would seem that the upper level of true acclimatization lies somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 feet. I would therefore advocate commencing to use oxygen somewhere between these two levels, preferably at the foot of the steep slopes leading up to the North Col. The use of small quantities would allow the climber to reach the Col without unduly tiring himself. From the North Col to a high camp situated at an altitude of about 26,500 feet, a slightly increased quantity of oxygen would suffice to enable the climber to progress almost as rapidly as he would in the much lower levels of the Alps. We know from experience that a camp at the above-mentioned altitude can be readily established, and in all except the worst of weather conditions, a party can make its way down again. Between the camp and the summit there would be a vertical height of only 2,500 feet, and it is conceivable that with a full supply of oxygen this distance could be covered in as little as 4 hours. I am strongly of the opinion that only one camp should be used between the North Col and the summit. No matter what precautions are taken, man's strength is rapidly sapped during the stay at these great altitudes, and the plan of campaign most likely to ensure success would appear to be leisurely and comfortable progress as far as the North Col, the establishment of a high camp at 26,500 feet, and a final dash to the summit. This last part of the program, however, would not be feasible unless a small dump of oxygen were made at a height of about 27,500 feet. To do this, it would be necessary for a specially detailed party to spend one night at the high camp, and on the following day employ their strength in making a dump somewhere above the shoulder. This done, they would then be able to return to the North Col with the satisfaction of knowing that they had made it possible for the actual climbing party to win through. It is by no means yet certain which is the best line of approach to the North Col. The route hitherto followed, via the East Rongbuk Glacier, is tedious and roundabout, but it has the advantage of being well sheltered from the wind, and, except for the final steep slopes beneath the Col, safe under any conditions. Much more direct, however, and probably less arduous, is the approach from over the main Rongbuk Glacier. The line of ascent thence to the summit of the Col presents no real difficulty, and, provided it is not found to be too exposed to the wind, is undoubtedly much safer, even after heavy snowfalls, than that previously followed. In the light of past experience, one can hardly hope to count on good weather as an ally. Adequate protection in the form of wind-proof clothing will enable the climber to face all but actual snowstorms. Climbing parties making the final assaults on the summit should be small, consisting of 2 men and no more. In the event of one man collapsing, his comrade, if at all up to scratch, should be able to get him down in safety. By so limiting the size of the parties, a number of attacks, each one as strong as if effected by a large and cumbersome team of say 4, could be carried out. Again, in the case of small parties, as suggested, mutual attention to each other's oxygen outfit is possible, and any necessary repair or adjustment more expeditiously made. The type of climber who should go farthest on Mount Everest would appear to be similar to that which best suits the Alps. Of the physical attributes necessary, the following points, in addition to what is usually termed perfect physical fitness, may be emphasized. In the rarefied atmosphere of high altitudes, the larger the vital capacity, the better. By the term vital capacity is meant the maximum amount of air an individual is able to expel from the lungs by voluntary effort after taking the deepest possible inspiration. Compared with the lean, spare type of individual, the thick-set, often muscle-bound man, though possibly equal to an immense effort provided it is of short duration, is, as a rule, at a great disadvantage. The expedition has also shown beyond all possible doubt that the tall man is less prone to become fatigued than one of shorter stature. Again, as is well known amongst mountaineers, the long-legged, short-trunk type of body is immensely superior to the short-legged, long-trunk type. Perhaps more important than perfect physical fitness to the would-be conqueror of Everest is the possession of the correct mentality. Absolutely essential are singleness of aim, namely, the attainment of the summit, and unswerving faith in the possibility of its achievement. Half-heartedness in even one member of the attacking party spells almost certain failure. Many a strong party in the Alps has failed to reach its objective through the depressing effect of the presence of one doubting Thomas. Like an insidious disease, a wavering, infirm belief is liable to spread and cause the destruction of the hopes of those who come into contact with it. The man who cannot face Mount Everest without at the same time proclaiming that the mountain has the odds in its favor, would do better by himself and others to leave the proposition severely alone. Of almost equal importance is the possession of what may be called mental energy or will power, or simply go. Mountaineers may be divided into two classes according to their behavior when, tired and well nigh exhausted, they are called upon to make yet one more supreme effort. There are those who, lacking the will power necessary to force their jaded bodies on to still further action, give in. Others, possessed of an almost inexhaustible fund of mental energy, will rise to the occasion, not once, but time and again. Physical pain is the safety valve which nature has provided to prevent harm being done to the body by exhaustion. But nature's margin of safety is a wide one. On Everest, this margin must be narrowed down if necessary to the vanishing point, and this can only be done by the climber whose fund of mental energy is sufficient to drive his body on and on, no matter how intense the pains of exhaustion, even to destruction if need be. End of chapter 8.
Section 18 of The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors. Chapter 9. Notes on Equipment by George Finch. Our recent experiences having shown that the greatest altitude at which acclimatization takes place is about 22,000 feet above sea level, it may be reasonably assumed that, from the climber's point of view, high altitude on Mount Everest begins at that height. Incidentally, also, on approaching the North Col over the East Rongbuk Glacier, the snow and ice conditions met with, up to this level, approximate very closely to summer conditions in the Alps. Above 22,000 feet, however, such conditions, particularly the state of the snow, resemble those met with in the Alps in midwinter. This high-altitude zone may be further divided into two subzones. The first, from 22,000 feet, the foot of the steep snow and ice slopes leading up to the North Col, to 23,000 feet, in which climatic conditions are by no means severe, as the North Col affords protection from the prevailing west wind, and the second, from 23,000 feet onwards, of which extreme cold and strong wind are the predominant characteristics. It is therefore evident that the climber must be equipped according to the zone in which he finds himself. In the first zone, clothing somewhat warmer than that used in the Alps in the summer is practically sufficient. Owing to the marked intensity of the sun's rays, however, it is advisable to cover the trunk with at least one layer of sun-proof material, such as a sun-proof shirt with spine pad, while a solar topi and suitable snow glasses constitute the best form of headgear. Crookes glasses of smoke blue color proved superior to other varieties. They afford complete protection from glare and do not cause eye strain and subsequent headache. As sunburn, even very superficial and involving only a small area, is invariably followed by conditions of feverishness which must impair one's fitness, a veil should be worn over the face and gloves on the hands. Oxygen should be employed from the foot of the North Col slopes onwards, for no useful purpose can be served by tiring oneself through not using it, when, as we have seen elsewhere, full recovery from fatigue is no longer possible at 23,000 feet. The second zone, from 23,000 feet onwards, where a radical change in climatic conditions is manifest, demands more complicated preparation. Wind is seldom absent, and the degree of intensity of the cold is comparable with that met with at the poles, and indeed probably often exceeds it. Also, owing to the rarefied state of the atmosphere, the cold is felt much more severely than would be the case at sea level. A far greater volume of air is expelled from the climber's lungs, and this air, at blood heat and under low pressure, approximating to 1/3 of an atmosphere, is saturated with moisture drawn from the body via the lungs. The result is a proportionately far greater loss of animal heat. Further, the partial pressure of oxygen contained in a normal atmosphere becomes so low at altitudes over 23,000 feet that unless the climber has recourse to a supply of oxygen carried by himself, his climbing efficiency is enormously reduced. The climbing equipment of the mountaineer in this second zone of high altitude should therefore include, firstly, a supply of oxygen, secondly, warm and windproof clothing and footgear, thirdly, plenty of food and drink, as the use of oxygen has a most stimulating effect upon the appetite. The oxygen equipment has already been fully described by Mr. Unna in the Alpine Journal, volume 34, page 235. The apparatus is, in principle, quite simple. It consists of a frame carried on the shoulders of the climber, at whose back, in a rack attached to the frame, are 4 steel cylinders filled with oxygen compressed to 120 atmospheres. From the cylinders, the oxygen is taken by means of copper tubes over to an instrument arm in front of the climber. This instrument arm, also attached to the frame, carries the pressure gauges and so forth, which indicate how much oxygen the climber is left and how rapidly the supplies are being used up. Close to the instrument arm and readily accessible are the valves necessary for controlling the rate of flow of oxygen from the apparatus. From the instrument arm, the oxygen passes through a flexible rubber tubing up to a mask covering the face of the climber. The two types of mask supplied to the expedition proved useless, partly owing to their stifling effect upon the wearer, and partly to the fact that saliva and moisture collected rapidly under them and froze. Both, therefore, had to be discarded. But fortunately, I was able to make a substitute which functioned successfully. This mask consisted of a rubber tube into which is let a rubber bladder by means of a glass T-piece, or by means of two straight pieces of glass tube let in at opposite ends of the bladder. One end of the rubber tube is fastened to the tube of the apparatus out of which the oxygen flows, the other end being held in the climber's mouth. On exhaling, the climber closes the rubber tube by biting upon it, and the oxygen issuing from the apparatus, instead of being wasted, is stored up in the rubber bladder. On inhaling, the pressure of the teeth is released sufficiently to allow the rubber tube to open, thus permitting the oxygen stored up in the bladder to flow into the climber's mouth, whence, mixing with the air exhaled, it is drawn into the lungs. The chief advantages of this mask are that, firstly, it economizes oxygen to the greatest possible extent, and secondly, the swelling and the shrinking of the bladder during each exhalation and inhalation, respectively, give the climber a fair idea as to how rapidly the oxygen is flowing from the apparatus, and thus enables him to keep a check upon the readings of the flow meter, or instrument which indicates the rate of flow of gas. In actual practice, it was found that in the space of a few minutes, the climber used the mask quite automatically. The biting upon and closing the rubber tube and subsequent opening were performed without mental effort. A certain amount of breathing takes place via the pores of the skin. As, however, the best clothing for a climber on Mount Everest is windproof, there is a likelihood of the air surrounding the body becoming stale, in which case the process of skin breathing is seriously impeded. This difficulty could be easily surmounted by flushing out the stale air by means of a tube inserted inside the climber's clothes, the flushing out process being done at intervals by temporarily fixing this tube to the orifice of the oxygen apparatus. It is not known definitely whether the advantage gained would be worth the trouble, but there is every reason for believing so. In any case, it is a matter which might well be critically tested on the next expedition. Cigarette smoking proved of great value at high altitudes. Jeffrey Bruce, Tidgebeer, and I, after pitching camp at 25,500 feet, settled down inside our little tent about 2:30 in the afternoon. From then until 7 o'clock the following evening, we used no oxygen at all. At first, we noticed that unless one kept one's mind on the question of breathing, that is, made breathing a voluntary process instead of the involuntary process it ordinarily is, one suffered from lack of air and a consequent feeling of suffocation, a feeling from which one recovered by voluntarily forcing the lungs to work faster than they would of their own accord. There is a physiological explanation for this phenomenon. At normal altitudes, human blood holds in solution a considerable quantity of carbon dioxide, which serves to stimulate the nerve center controlling one's involuntary breathing. At great altitudes, however, where, in order to obtain a sufficiency of oxygen, the climber is forced to breathe enormous volumes of air. Much of this carbon dioxide is washed out of the blood, and the nerve center, no longer sufficiently stimulated, fails to promote an adequately active involuntary breathing. A voluntary process must be substituted, and this throws a considerable strain upon the mind and renders sleep impossible. On smoking cigarettes, we discovered after the first few inhalations it was no longer necessary to concentrate on breathing, the process becoming once more an involuntary one. Evidently, some constituent of cigarette smoke takes the place and performs the stimulating function of the carbon dioxide normally present. The effect of a cigarette lasted for about 3 hours. Clothing is a most important matter. It would be difficult to exaggerate the intensity of the cold encountered at high altitudes on Mount Everest. Several layers, the innermost of which should be of silk, the others wool of moderate weight, form a much better protection against cold than 1 or 2 heavy layers. The chief item of clothing, however, should consist of a jumper and trousers made of windproof material. 2 of these windproof suits should be worn one above the other, and every precaution taken to reduce the circulation of the air to the smallest possible extent. The hands must be protected in accordance with the same principles, and the head. I used a RNAS pattern flying helmet and found it most satisfactory. Helmet and snow glasses should completely cover the head and face, leaving no skin exposed. Boots were a source of trouble to all, but fortunately we had so many different designs which we could test out thoroughly that we are now able to form a very shrewd idea as to which kind is the most suitable. Leather conducts heat too well for reliance to be placed upon it for the preservation of warmth. The uppers of the boots should be of felt, strengthened where necessary to prevent stretching, by leather straps covered by duraprene canvas. Toe and heel caps must be hard and strong, and the former especially should be high, so that the toes are given plenty of room. The sole of the boot should be composed of a layer of thin leather attached to a layer of 3-ply wood, hinged in 2 sections at the instep. A thin layer of felt should form the inside of the sole. The boots should be large enough to accommodate in comfort 2 pairs of thick socks, or even better still, 2 pairs of thin socks and 1 pair of thick socks. Nails used in the boots should penetrate through the leather into the 3-ply wood, but not through the latter. In conclusion, I should like to thank the governing body of the Imperial College of Science and Technology for granting me the necessary leave to enable me to take part in the 1922 Mount Everest expedition, and also for granting me facilities for carrying out a considerable number of investigations in the laboratory of the Department of Chemical Technology upon questions relating, amongst others, to oxygen equipment, fuels, and vacuum flasks. These last were required in order to enable us to keep foods liquid at heights over 23,000 feet, and the flasks obtained on the market proved quite useless for this purpose in view of the fact that they had not been sufficiently well evacuated. End of section 18. Read by Carrie Adams, your book voice, at Mesa, Arizona, on the 23rd of March, 2022.
Chapter 10, Part Number 19 of the Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by caveat. The Assault on Everest, 1922, by various authors. Chapter 10, The Third Attempt, by George Lee Mallory. The project of making a third attempt this season was mooted immediately on the return of Finch and Geoffrey Bruce to base camp. There, in hours of idleness, we had discussed their prospects and wondered what they would be doing as we gazed at the mountain to make out the weather on the great ridge. We were not surprised to learn when they came down that the summit was still unconquered, and we were not yet prepared to accept defeat. The difficulty was to find a party. Of the 6 who had already been engaged, only one was obviously fit for another great effort. Somerville had shown a recuperative capacity beyond the rest of us. After one day at the base, he had insisted on going up again to Camp 3 in case he might be of use to the others. The rest were more or less knocked out. Moore's had frostbitten fingers and toes, from which he was now suffering constant pain, caused grave anxiety of most serious consequences. The only plan for him was to go down to a lower elevation as soon as possible. Norton's feet had also been affected. He complained at first only of bruises, but the cold had come through the soles of his boots. His trouble, too, was frostbite. In any case, he could not have come up again, for the strain had told on his heart, and he now found himself left without energy or strength. Geoffrey Bruce's feet also were so badly frostbitten that he could not walk. Finch, however, was not yet to be counted out. He was evidently very much exhausted, but an examination of his heart revealed no disorder. It was hoped that in 5 or 6 days he would be able to start again. My own case was doubtful. Of my frostbitten fingertips, only one was giving trouble. The extremity above the first joint was black, but the injury was not very deep. Longstaff, who had taken an interest which we all appreciated in preventing us from doing ourselves permanent injury, pointed out the probability that the fingers already touched and highly susceptible to cold would be much more severely injured next time, and was inclined to turn me down from his medical point of view on account of my fingers alone. A much more serious matter was the condition of my heart. I felt weak and lazy when it was a question of the least physical exertion, and the heart was found to have a thrill. Though I was prepared to take the risks with my fingers, I was prepared to take none with my heart, even had General Bruce allowed me. However, I did not abandon hope. My heart was examined again on June 3rd. No thrill was heard, and though my pulse was rapid and accelerated quickly with exertion, it was capable of satisfactory recovery. We at once arranged that Somerville, Finch, and I, together with Wakefield and Crawford, should set forth the same day. It was already evident that whatever we were to do would now have to wait for the weather. Though the Lama at the Rongbuk monastery had told us that the monsoon was usually to be expected around June 10, and we knew that it was late last year, the signs of its approach were gathering every day. Mount Everest could rarely be seen after 9 or 10 a.m. until the clouds cleared away in the evening, and a storm approaching from the West Rongbuk Glacier would generally sweep through the valley in the afternoon. Though we came to despise this blustering phenomenon, for nothing worse came of it than light hail or snow, either at our camp or higher, we should want much fairer days for climbing, and each storm threatened to be the beginning of something far more serious. However, we planned to be on the spot to take any chance offered. The signs that were even more ominous than usual as Finch and I walked up to Camp 1 on the afternoon of June 3rd. We could hardly feel optimistic, and it was soon apparent that, far from having recovered his strength, my companion was quite unfit for another big expedition. We walked slowly and frequently halted. It was painful to see what efforts it cost him to make any progress. However, he persisted in coming on. We had not long disposed ourselves comfortably within the 4 square walls of our sangha, always a pleasant change from the sloping sides of a tent, when snow began to fall. Released at last by the west wind which had held it back, the monsoon was free to work its will, and we soon understood that the great change of weather had now come. Fine glistening particles were driven by the wind through the chinks in our walls, to be drifted on the floor or on our coverings where we lay during the night, and as morning grew the snow still fell as thickly as ever. Finch wisely decided to go back, and we charged him with a message to General Bruce, saying that we saw no reason at present to alter our plans. With the whole day to spend confined and inactive, we had plenty of time to consider what we ought to do under these conditions. We went over well-worn arguments once more. it would have been an obvious and easy course for which no one could approach us. So said simply, the monsoon has come. This is the end of the climbing season. It is time to go home. But the case we felt was not yet hopeless. The monsoon is too variable and uncertain to be so easily admitted as the final arbiter. There might yet be good prospects ahead of us. It was not unreasonable to expect an interval of fine weather after the first heavy snow, and with 8 or 10 fair days, the third attempt might still be made. In any case, to retire now, if the smallest chance remained to us, would be an unworthy end to the expedition. We need not run our heads into obvious danger, but rather than be stopped by a general estimate of conditions, we would prefer to retire before some definite risk that we were not prepared to take, or simply fail to overcome the difficulties. After a second night of unremitting snowfall, the weather on the morning of June 5th improved, and we decided to go on. Low and heavy clouds were still flowing down the East Rongbuk Glacier, but precipitation ceased at an early hour and the sky brightened to the west. It was surprising, after all we had seen of the flakes passing our door, that no great amount of snow was lying on the stones about our camp. The snow had come on a warm current and melted or evaporated, so that after all the depth was no more than 6 inches at this elevation, 17,500 feet. Even on the glacier we went up a long way before noticing a perceptible increase of depth. We passed Camp 2, not requiring to halt at this stage, and were well up towards Camp 3 before the fresh snow became a serious impediment. It was still snowing up here, though not very heavily. There was nothing to cheer the grey scene. The clinging snow about our feet was so wet that even the best of our boots was soaked through, and the last 2 hours up to Camp 3 were tiresome enough. Nor was it a cheering camp when we reached it. The tents had been struck for the safety of the poles, but not packed up. We found them half full of snow and ice. The stores were all buried. Everything we wanted had first to be dug out. The snow up here was so much deeper that we anxiously discussed the possibility of going further. With 15 to 18 inches of snow to contend with, not counting drifts, the labour would be excessive, and until the snow solidified there would be considerable danger at several points. But the next morning broke fine. We had soon a clear sky and glorious sunshine. It was the warmest day that any of us remembered at Camp 3, and we watched the amazing rapidity with which the snow solidified and the rocks began to appear about our camp. Our spirits rose. The side of Everest facing us looked white and cold, but we observed a cloud of snow blown from the north ridge. It would not be long at this rate before it was fit to climb. We had already resolved to use oxygen on the third attempt. It was improbable that we should beat our own record without it, for the strain of previous efforts would count against us, and we had not put the time to improve on our organisation by putting a second camp above the North Col. Somerville, after Finch's explanation of the mechanical details, felt perfectly confident that he could manage the oxygen apparatus, and those who had used oxygen were convinced that they went up more easily with its help than they could expect to go without it. Somerville and I intended to profit by their experience. They had discovered that the increased combustion in the body required a larger supply of food. We must arrange for bountiful provision. Their camp at 25,000 feet had been too low. We would try to establish one now, as we had attended before, at 26,000 feet. We hoped for a further advantage in going higher than Finch and Bruce had done before using oxygen. Whereas they had started using it at 21,000 feet, we intended to go up to our own old camp at 25,000 feet without using it, perhaps use a cylinder each up to 26,000 feet, and at all events start from that height for the summit with a full supply of 4 cylinders. If this was not the correct policy as laid down by Professor Dreyer, it would at least be a valuable experiment. Our chief anxiety under these new conditions was to provide for the safety of our porters. We hoped that after fixing our 5th camp at 26,000 feet at the earliest 3 days, hence on the 4th day of fine weather, the porters might be able to go down by themselves to the North Col in easy conditions, to guard against the dangers of concealed crevasses. There Crawford would meet them at the foot of the North Ridge to conduct them properly roped to Camp 4. As the supply officer at this camp, he would also be able to superintend the descent over the first steep slope of certain porters who would go down from Camp 4 without sleeping after carrying up their loads. But the North Col had first to be reached. With so much new snow to contend with, we should hardly get there in a day. If we were to make the most of our chance in the interval of fair weather, we should lose no time in carrying up the loads for some part of the distance. It was decided, therefore, to begin this work on the following day, June 7th. In the ascent to the North Col, after the recent snowfall, we considered that an avalanche was to be feared only in one place, the steep final slope below the shelf. There we could afford to run no risk. We must test the snow and be certain it was safe before we could cross this slope. Probably we should be obliged to leave our loads below it, having gained, as a result of our day's work, the great advantage of a track. An avalanche might also come down, we thought, on the first steep slope where the ascent began, but here it could do us no harm, and the behaviour of the snow on this slope would be a test of its condition. The party, Somerville, Crawford and I, with 14 porters, Wakefield was to be supply officer at Camp 3, set out at 8 a.m. In spite of the hard frost of the previous night, the crust was far from bearing our weight. We sank up to our knees in almost every step, and 2 hours were taken in traversing the snowfield. At 10:15, Somerville, I, a porter, and Crawford, roped up in that order, began to work up the steep ice slope, now covered with snow. It was clear that the three of us without loads must take the lead in turn, stamping out the track for our porters. These men, after their immense efforts on the first and second attempts, had all volunteered to go high, as they had said once more, and everything must be done to ease the terrible work of carrying the loads over soft snow. No trace was found of our previous tracks, and we were soon arguing as to where exactly they might be as we slanted across the slope. It was remarkable that the snow adhered so well to the ice that we were able to get up without cutting steps. Everything was done by trenching the snow to induce it to come down, if it would. Every test gave a satisfactory result. Once this crucial place was passed, we plodded on without hesitation. If the snow would not come down where we had formerly encountered steep bare ice, a fortiori, above, on the gentler slopes, we had nothing to fear. The thought of an avalanche was dismissed from our minds. It wasn't necessarily slow work, forging our way through the deep snow, but the party was going extraordinarily well, and the porters were evidently determined to get on. Somerville gave us a long lead, and Crawford next, in spite of the handicap of shorter legs, struggled upwards in some of the worst snow we met until I relieved him. I found the effort at each step so great that no method of breathing I had formerly employed was adequate. It was necessary to pause after each lifting movement for a whole series of breaths, rapid at first and gradually slower, before the weight was transferred again to the other foot. About 1:30 I halted, and the porters, followed on 3 separate ropes, soon came up with the leading party. We should have been glad to stay where we were for a long rest, but the hour was already late, and as Somerville was ready to take the lead again, we decided to push on. We were now about 400 feet below a conspicuous block of ice and 600 feet below Camp 4, still on the gentle slopes of the corridor. Somerville had advanced only 100 feet, rather up the slope than across it, and the last party of porters had barely begun to move up the steps. The scene was particularly bright and windless. As we rarely spoke, nothing was to be heard but the laboured panting of our lungs. This stillness was suddenly disturbed. We were startled by an ominous sound, sharp, arresting, violent, and yet somehow soft like an explosion of untapped gunpowder. I had never before on a mountainside heard such a sound, but all of us, I imagine, knew instinctively what it meant, as though we had become accustomed to hear it every day of our lives. In a moment I observed the surface of the snow, broken and puckered, where it had been even for a few yards to the right of me. I took 2 steps convulsively in this direction, with some quick thought of getting us nearer to the edge of the danger that threatened us. Then I began to move slowly downwards, inevitably carried on the whole moving surface by a force I was utterly powerless to resist. Somehow I managed to turn out from the slope so as to avoid being pushed headlong and backwards down it. For a second or two I seemed hardly to be in danger as I went quietly sliding down with the snow. Then the rope at my waist tightened and held me back. A wave of snow came over me and I was buried. I suppose that the matter was settled. However, I called to mind the experiences related to me by other parties, and it suggested that the best chance of escape in this situation lay in swimming. I thrust out my arms above my head and actually went through some sort of motions of swimming on my back. Beneath the surface of the snow, with nothing to inform the senses of the world outside it, I had no impression of speed after the first acceleration. I struggled in the tumbling snow, unconscious of everything else, until perhaps only a few seconds later I knew the pace was easing up. I felt an increasing pressure about my body, and I wondered how tightly I should be squeezed, and then the avalanche came to rest. My arms were free. My legs were near the surface. After a brief struggle, I was standing again, surprised and breathless in the motionless snow. But the rope was tight at my waist. The porter tied on next to me, I suppose, must be deeply buried. To my further surprise, he quickly emerged unharmed as myself. Somerville and Crawford, too, though they had been above me by the rope's length, were now quite close and soon extricated themselves. We subsequently made out that their experiences had been very similar to mine, but where were the rest? Looking down the foam of snow, we saw one group of porters some little distance, perhaps 150 feet below us. Presumably the others must be buried somewhere between us and them, and though no sign of these missing men appeared, we at once prepared to find and dig them out. The porters we saw still stood their ground instead of coming up to help. We soon made out that they were the party who had been immediately behind us, and they were pointing below them. They had travelled further than us in the avalanche, presumably because they were nearer the centre, where it was moving more rapidly. The other two parties, one of 4 and one of 5 men grouped together, must have been carried even further. We could still hope that they were safe, but as we hurried down, we soon saw that beneath the place where the 4 porters were standing was a formidable drop. It was only too plain that the missing men had been swept over it. We had no difficulty in finding a way round this obstacle. In a very short time we were standing under its shadow. The ice cliff was from 40 to 60 feet high in different places. The crevasse at its foot was more or less filled up with avalanche snow. Our fears were soon confirmed. One man was quickly uncovered and found to be still breathing. Before long we were certain that he would live. Another whom we dug out near him had been killed by the fall. He and his party appeared to have struck the hard lip of the crevasse and were lying under the snow on or near the ridge of it. The 4 porters who had escaped soon pulled themselves together after the first shock of the accident, and now worked here with Crawford and did everything they could to extricate the other bodies, while Somerville and I went down the crevasse. A loop of rope which we pulled up convinced us that the other party must be there. It was slow work, loosening the snow with a pick or adze of an ice axe, and shoveling it with our hands, but we were able to follow the rope to the bodies. One was dug up lifeless, another was found upside down, and when we uncovered his face, Somerville thought he was still breathing. We had the greatest difficulty in extricating the man. So tightly was the snow packed around his limbs. His load, 4 oxygen cylinders on his steel frame, had to be cut from his back, and eventually he was dragged out. Though buried for about 40 minutes, he had survived the fall and the suffocation, and suffered no serious harm. Of the 2 others in this party of 4, we found only one. We had at length to give up a hopeless search with the certain knowledge that the first of them to be swept over the cliff, and the most deeply buried, must long ago be dead. Of the other 5, all the bodies were recovered, but only one was alive. The 2 who had so marvellously escaped were able to walk down to Camp 3, and were almost perfectly well the next day. The other 7 were killed. This tragic calamity was naturally the end of the 3rd attempt to climb Mount Everest. The surviving porters who had lost their friends or brothers behaved with dignity, making no noisy parade of the grief they felt. We asked them whether they wished to go up and bring down the bodies for orderly burial. They preferred to leave them where they were. For my part, I was glad of this decision. What better burial could one have than to lie in the snow where they fell? In their honour, a large cairn was built at Camp 3. A few words might be added with regard to this accident. No one will imagine we had pushed on recklessly disregarding the new conditions of fresh snow. 3 members of the Alpine Club with experience of judging snow for themselves, chiefly of course in the Alps, had all supposed that the party was safe. They had imagined that on those gentle slopes the snow would not move. In what way had they been deceived? The fact that the avalanche snow came to rest on the slope where they were proves that their calculations were not so very far wrong. But the snow cannot all have been of the quality that adhered so well to the steep ice slope lower down. Where the avalanche started, not far from the line of their steps, but 100 feet higher, it was shaded to some extent by a broken wall of ice. There, perhaps, it had both drifted more deeply and remained more free and powdery, and the weight of this snow was probably sufficient to push the other down the slope once its surface had been disturbed. More experience, more knowledge, might perhaps have warned us not to go there. One can never know enough about snow. But looking up the corridor again after the event, I wondered how I could ever have been certain not to be deceived by appearances so innocent. The regret of all members of the expedition for the loss of our 7 porters will have been elsewhere expressed. It is my part only to add this. The work of carrying up our camps on Mount Everest is beyond the range of a simple contract measured in terms of money. The porters had come to share in our enterprise, and these men died in an act of voluntary service freely rendered and faithfully performed. End of Chapter 10, Part 19. Chapter 11, Part number 20 of the Assault on Mount Everest, 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by caveat. The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors. Conclusions by George Lee Mallory. It might be supposed that, from the experience of 2 expeditions to Mount Everest, it would be possible to deduce an estimate of the dangers and difficulties involved and to formulate a plan for overcoming the obstacles which would meet with universal approval among mountaineers. But, in fact, though many deductions could hardly be denied, I should be surprised to find, even among us of the second party, anything like complete agreement either in our judgment of events or in our ideas for the future. Accordingly, I must be understood as expressing only my personal opinions. The reader, no doubt, will judge the book more interesting if he finds the joint authors disagreeing among themselves. The story of the first attempt to climb the mountain in 1922 will have no doubts on one point. The final camp was too low. However strong a party may be brought to the assault, their aim, unless they are provided with oxygen, must be to establish a camp considerably higher than our camp at 25,000 feet. The whole performance of the porters encourages us to believe that this can be done. Some of them went to the height of 25,000 feet and more, not only once, but thrice. And they accomplished this feat with strength to spare. It is reasonable to suppose that these same men, or others of their type, could carry loads up to 27,000 feet. But it would be equally unreasonable to suppose that they could reach this height in one day from a camp on Chang La at 23,000 feet. No one would be so foolish as to organize an attempt on this assumption. 2 camps instead of 1 must be placed above the Chang La. Another stage must be added to the structure before the climbing party sets forth to reach the summit. But how exactly is this to be done? It is to this question that one would wish to deduce an answer from the experience of 1922. It is very unlikely that any future party will find itself in the position to carry out any ideal plan of organization. Ideally, they ought to start by considering what previous performances might help or hinder the aim of bringing the party of attack in the fittest possible condition to the last camp. What ought they to have done or not to have done, having regard to acclimatization? Is it still impossible to lay down the law on this head? After the first expedition, I suppose that the limit of acclimatization must be somewhere around 21,000 feet. It now seems probable that it is higher. One of the psychologists who has been most deeply concerned with this problem of acclimatization considered it would probably be desirable, from the psychological point of view, to stay 4 or 5 days at 25,000 feet before proceeding to attempt the last 2 stages on consecutive days. Those who slept at Camp 5 of the first attempt would certainly be agreed in our attitude towards this counsel. The desire to continue the advance and spend another night at a higher elevation, if it persisted at all for so long a time at 25,000 feet, would be chilled to tepidity, and the increasing desire to get away from Camp 5 might lead to a retreat instead of advance. The conditions must be altogether more comfortable if the climbers are to derive any advantage from their rustication at this altitude. It would not be impossible, perhaps, if every effort were concentrated on this end. To make a happy home where the aspiring mountaineers might pass a long weekend in enjoyment of the simplest life at 25,000 feet, it would not be practical, having regard to other ends to be served by the system of transport. But it might well to spend a similar period for acclimatization 2,000 feet lower on the Chang La. There, a very comfortable camp with perfect shelter from the prevailing wind and good snow to lie on can easily be established. Knowles spent 3 successive nights there in 1922 and apparently was the better rather than the worse for the experience. No less important in this connection is the effort of exertions at higher altitudes on a man's subsequent performance. We have to take into account the condition of the climbing parties when they return to the base camp after reaching approximately 77,000 feet. With one exception, all the climbers were affected in various degrees by their exertions, to the prejudice of future efforts. It would seem, therefore, that they cannot have had much strength to spare for the final stage to the summit. But there was a general agreement among the climbers that it was not so much the normal exertion of climbing upwards that was in itself unduly exhausting, but in the addition of anything that might be considered abnormal, such as cutting steps, contending with the wind, pushing on for a particular reason at a faster pace, and the many little things that had been done in camp. It is difficult from the normal elevation to appreciate how great is the difference between establishing a camp on the one hand and merely ascending to one already established on the other. If it ever proves possible to organize an advance party whose business it would be to establish at 25,000 feet a much more comfortable camp than ours in 1922, and if, in addition, a man could be spared to undertake the preparation of meals, the climbers detailed for the highest section of all would both be spared a considerable fatigue and would have a better chance of real rest and sleep. The peculiar dangers of climbing at high altitudes were illustrated by the experience of 1922. The difficulty of maintaining the standard of sound and accurate mountaineering among a party all more or less affected by the conditions, and the delays and misfortunes that may arise from the exhaustion of one of the party, are dangers which might be minimized by a supporting party. 2 men remaining at the final camp and 2 men near Camp 5 watching the progress of the unit of assault along the final ridge and prepared to come to their assistance might serve to produce vital stimulants, hot tea or merely water, at the critical moment and to protect the descent. It is a counsel of perfection to suggest providing against contingencies on this lavish scale. It is well to bear in mind the ideal, and there is besides precaution which surely can and will be taken, to take a supply of oxygen for restorative purposes. The value of oxygen for restoring exhausted and warming cold men was sufficiently well illustrated during the second attempt in 1922. The question as to whether the use of oxygen will otherwise help or hinder climbers is one about which opinions may be expected to disagree. Anyone who thinks that it's impossible to get up without oxygen can claim that nothing has shown it to be impossible to get up with its aid. For my part, I don't think it's impossible to get up without oxygen. The difference of atmospheric pressure between 27,000 feet and the summit is small, and it is safe to conclude that men who have exerted themselves at 27,000 feet could live without difficulty for a number of hours on the summit. As to whether their power of progress would give out before reaching 29,000 feet, it is impossible to dogmatize. I can only say that nothing in the experience of the first attempt has led me to suppose that those last 2,000 feet cannot be climbed in a day. I am not competent to sift and weigh all the evidence as to whether, how much, and with what consumption of gas it was easiest to proceed up the slopes of Mount Everest, with oxygen so far as Finch and Bruce went on, that memorable day. But I do venture to combat the suggestion that it is necessarily easier to reach the top in that manner. I think no one will dispute the statement that the final camp for the second attempt was too low, as it had been for the first, to enable the oxygen party to reach the summit. With the same apparatus, it will be necessary, in this case, also to provide a second camp above the North Col, and the question for the moment will ultimately be, is it possible to add to that immense burden of transport to 27,000 feet the weight of the oxygen cylinders required? The weather, in all probability, will have something to say to this problem. The expedition of 1922 was certainly not favoured by the weather. There were no continuous spells of calm, fine days, and the summer snows began a week earlier than the most usual date. One wonders what sort of weather is to be expected with the most favourable conditions on Mount Everest. It is conceivable that a series of calm, fine days sometimes precede the monsoon, but when we consider the perpetual winds of Tibet at all seasons, it seems unlikely that Mount Everest is often immune from this abominable visitation. It is far more likely that the calm day is a rare exception, and only to be expected when the northwesterly current is neutralized by the monsoon from the southwest. The ill luck of 1922 may probably be computed as no more than those 7 days by which the monsoon preceded expectation. With so short a time for preparations in advance, we were indeed unfortunate in meeting an early monsoon, and it is hardly possible considerably to extend the available time by starting earlier. There was only the barest trickle of water at base camp on May 1st, 1922, and the complications involved by the necessity of melting snow for water, both here and at all higher stages for any considerable time, would be a severe handicap. But it must be remembered that the second attempt was made a week before the monsoon broke. Time appeared short on the mountain chiefly from the threat of bad weather, and the signs showing that the majority of days were, to say the least, extremely disagreeable for climbing high on the mountain. If others are confronted by similar conditions, they too will probably feel that each fine day must be utilized and the attack must be pressed on. For the fine days past will not come back, and ahead is the uncertain monsoon. A final question may now be asked. What advantages will another expedition have which we did not have in 1922? In one small and in one large matter, the next expedition may be better equipped. It was disappointing, after so much time and thought had been expended over the problem of footgear, that nothing was evolved in 1922 which succeeded in taking the place of alpine boots of a well-known patterns. The great disadvantage of these sort of boots is that one cannot wear crampons with them at high altitudes, for the strap, bound tightly around the foot, will almost certainly cause frostbite. Either different boots or different spikes must be invented if the climbers are to have crampons or their equivalent. It is essential that they should be so equipped to avoid the labour of step cutting. The lack of equipment might well rob them of victory on the final slopes below the summit. This matter of footgear is not so very small after all, but a still more important one is the oxygen apparatus. It is conceivable, and I believe by no means unlikely, that a different type of cylinder may be used in the future, and capable of containing more oxygen compared with the same weight than those of 1922. A 50% improvement in this direction should alter the whole problem of using oxygen. With this advantage, it might well be possible to go to the top and back with the 4 cylinders which a man may be expected to carry from a height of 25,000 feet or a little higher. If a second camp above the North Col becomes unnecessary in this way, the whole effort required, and especially the effort of transport, will be reduced to the scale of what was already been accomplished, and can no doubt be accomplished again. The further advantage of a future expedition is simply that of experience. It amounts to something, one cannot say how much. In small ways, a number of mistakes may be avoided. The provision of this and that may be more accurately calculated according to tried values. The whole organization of life in high camps should be rather more efficient. Beyond all this, the experience of 1922 should help when the moment comes towards the making of a right plan. And a party which chooses rightly what to do and when to do it can so exclude other possibilities as to be certain that no better way could be chosen, has a great advantage. But when all this is said, as to experience and equipment, it still remains true that success requires a quality. History repeats itself perhaps, but in a vague and general fashion, only where mountains are concerned. The problem of reaching the summit is every time a fresh one. A keen eye for a fair opportunity and resource in grave emergencies are no less necessary to the mountaineer everywhere, not least upon Mount Everest, than determination to carry through the high project and the simple will to conquer in the struggle. End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors. Acclimatization at High Altitudes, by T. Howard Somervell. The Everest expedition of 1922 had no preconceived program of scientific investigation, and was first and foremost an attempt to get up the mountain. Though, as I had been connected with physiological research for some years, I was naturally anxious to make observations on the effect of altitude on the human frame. These observations were rather subjective and were unaccompanied by any accurate data. In other words, the reader will be relieved to hear that there are no tables of figures to be reproduced. Barcroft and others were in the course of their expedition to the Andes, and I knew full well their results would supply more accurate information on the exact process of acclimatization at high altitudes than anything we could do with our simpler apparatus. We left it to this other expedition, therefore, to supply the figures, while our observations were exclusively on the practical side. That is to say, we observed the rapidity and effect of acclimatization, while not investigating exactly how it is brought about. The first effect of altitude in such moderate degree as we encountered it on the plains of Tibet was almost entirely a mere breathlessness, which limited our rate of walking and increased the popularity of our uncomfortable Tibetan saddles when traveling uphill. A few of us had severe headaches from time to time. At the modest height of 17,000 feet, I noticed Cheyenne Stokes' respiration at night when lying down,
though never when sitting or standing, and I remember being distinctly amused at the fact that no one was unable to control it. Footnote: for the benefit of the non-medical reader, Cheyenne-Stokes breathing is the gradual alternation of shallow and deep respirations, usually about 10 shallow breaths, followed by respirations which get gradually deeper, then by 3 or 4 really deep ones, which become shallower until the cycle recommences. A few of the party had a single attack of vomiting, but no permanent effect was noticed, and by the time we had lived on the Tibetan plateau for a few weeks, we had lost all ill effects save only breathlessness, which of course persisted to some extent until we reached comparatively low elevations. Further effect at these heights was not noticed save in the case of some of the older members of the party, who suffered from a considerable loss of appetite while at the base camp at 16,000 feet. This effect on appetite did not improve as time went on. It was when we began the more serious work on the mountain that we made the most interesting observations on acclimatization, and proved both its rapidity, which was known before, and its persistence to great heights. Scientists of various schools had, before the start of the expedition, predicted that acclimatization would be impossible above the height of 20,000 feet. Why they had done so will always remain a mystery to me, but possibly they were misled by the fact that so many climbing expeditions in the past have failed somewhere in the region of 23,000 feet above sea level. We were enabled, however, to prove conclusively that acclimatization does go on to greater heights. In fact, I do not see a theoretical limit to it at any elevation below the top of Mount Everest. Our observations were largely subjective, but for that reason they are perhaps all the more to be appreciated by the general reader, and in view of their subjective nature, I may perhaps be pardoned in substituting feelings for figures and putting information in the form of a personal experience. When Mallory and I arrived at Camp 3 and established it on the site chosen by the reconnaissance party, our first concern was the preparation of another camp at the North Col. I shall never forget our first ascent up that accursed slope of snow and ice, each step a hardship, every foot a fight, until at last we lay almost exhausted on the top. After a day or two at Camp 3 below, we went up again to the Col, this time with Strutt and Mooreshead, and I think Norton. The ascent of the Col this time was hard work, but not more than that, and after the Col had been reached, Mooreshead and I were sufficiently cheerful to explore the way leading up to Everest. A day or two later we again ascended the North Col, and never really noticed more discomfort than was occasioned by breathlessness. Though not possessing the scientific data which explained this change in our condition, yet in those few days of life at 21,000 feet, we had become acclimatized to our altitude to a very remarkable degree. What had previously been a hard struggle had now become a comparatively easy job. By this rapid change in our constitution, we had not only proved the predictions of scientists to be wrong, but had gained the physical power which took us without artificial oxygen supply to 27,000 feet, and we had determined that acclimatization is not only possible, but is also quite rapid at these high altitudes. Thus, by sojourn and exercise for a week above 20,000 feet, we obtained the physiological equipment necessary for an attempt on the mountain, and at this point some personal experiences may be of interest, though possibly of no great importance. We found that, as we ascended, we fell into an automatic rate of breathing. Mallory preferred to breathe slowly and deeply, while rapid and shallower respirations appealed to me, but we all walked upwards at almost exactly the same rate at any given height. Below the North Col, I took 3 breaths to a step, while at 26,000 feet I was taking 5 complete respirations. But as long as I was walking slowly enough, I experienced no distress or discomfort. If one hurried for a short distance, one was forced to rest for a few seconds. A rest was imperative, and one felt it were impossible to do without it. But as long as an even pace was kept up, one had no desire to stop, nor to make one's admiration of the landscape an excuse for delaying one's comrades. At the height of 26,000 feet, I took my pulse, which was 180, and my respirations, which were 50 to 55 to the minute. But withal, one felt perfectly comfortable, even though these abnormal physiological conditions were present. No doubt, the heart must be young to stand this rate of beating for many hours, yet not too young, or it will easily become enlarged and permanently damaged. In view of our experiences, it seems justifiable to predict that acclimatization at 23,000 feet will be sufficient for the attainment of the summit of Mount Everest, if indeed a sojourn at 21,000 feet is insufficient, which is to my mind more than doubtful. The other important practical observation we made is less encouraging, namely that we all varied in our rate of acclimatization, and in fact some of our number, especially the older ones among us, actually seemed to deteriorate in condition while staying at a great height. But I think we prove that it is possible to climb to the summit of Everest without the use of oxygen, though the selection of men who are able to do so is very difficult until those heights are actually reached, at which acclimatization becomes established. Personally, I felt perfectly well at 27,000 feet, and my condition seemed no different at that height from what it had been at 25,000 feet or even lower. And I have no doubt there are many people, if only they can be found, who can get to the top of Everest unaided, save by their own physiological reaction to a life at 21,000 feet for a few days. If a number of such people were allowed to live at a height corresponding to our Camp 3 for a fortnight or so, making perhaps a few minor excursions to 23,000 or 24,000 feet, then I have no doubt from the physiological point of view that they will be able to climb Mount Everest, provided the weather is fine and the wind not too violent. Without allowing time for acclimatization to take place, it is probable that nobody, that is, unless some lusus naturae exists, will reach the summit. If artificially supplied oxygen be used, the acclimatization may not be necessary. But the danger of an attempt by non-acclimatized men with oxygen apparatus is that a breakdown of the apparatus might lead to serious consequences, while a fully acclimatized man is probably just as capable of standing a height of 29,000 feet unaided as you or I would be able to stand the height of Mont Blanc tomorrow. When the expedition of 1922 started, I was personally of opinion that nobody could exist at a height about 25,000 or 26,000 feet without oxygen, but since we have proved that this can be done, it seems that the chances of climbing the mountain are probably greater if oxygen be not used. For the apparatus and the spare cylinders required necessitate the use of a large number of coolies, while in an attempt without oxygen, only 3 or 4 coolies are required for the camping equipment and the food at the highest camp. Therefore, it seems that the best chance of getting to the top of Mount Everest lies in the sending out of some 9 or 10 climbers who can remain at a high camp, become thoroughly acclimatized, and then make a series of expeditions up the mountain, 3 or so at a time, as continuously as weather conditions will allow. By adopting these tactics, the number of possible attempts up the mountain can be increased, and it seems to me that the chances of climbing to the summit lie in the multiplicity of possible attempts rather than in any other direction. It would be better to prepare for a number of attempts each by a small but acclimatized party rather than to stake all on 1 or 2 highly organized endeavors, in which oxygen and a large number of coolies are used. It is only a small proportion of coolies who can get up to the heights of 25,000 or 27,000 feet, and they should be used for any one attempt as sparingly as possible. During the war, we all had our ideas of how it should be run, and they were generally wrong. The above plan is the writer's idea of how to climb Mount Everest, and may or may not be right, but is enunciated for what it is worth. Among subsidiary effects of extreme altitudes were those upon appetite, temper, and mental condition generally. Most of us will admit a good deal of peevishness and irritability while at a level of 22,000 feet and more. For the altitude undoubtedly makes one lose to some extent one's mental balance, and the first way in which this appears on the surface is by a ruffling of the temper. In addition, one has a certain lack of determination, and when at a height approaching 27,000 feet, I remember distinctly that I cared very little whether we reached the top of Everest or not. A good instance of this altered attitude of mind is provided by the fact that Finch and Bruce took a camera with them on their ascent and forgot to take any photographs of their last day's climbing. I have mentioned the deleterious effect of altitude on the appetite of some of our older members, but the same was to some extent true of us all. I have the most vivid recollection of distaste for food during our first few days at Camp 3, and especially of the way one had almost to push a prune down one's throat on the way up to the North Col. But with the majority of us, this distaste for food, especially for meat and the slowly digested foods, diminished during our sojourn at great heights, though our appetites never became quite normal until we reached one of the lower camps. Those who had oxygen reported that they had large appetites above the North Col, and there is no doubt that it is the rarefaction of the air that causes this alteration of the appetite. One may perhaps be justified in assuming that the secretion of gastric juice is diminished while air that is poor in oxygen is inhaled, though it is rather hard to understand how this is brought about. Although acclimatization is not entirely connected with the actual increase in the number of blood corpuscles, as has been proved by Barcroft in 1922, yet this is still recognized as one of the important factors in its production. But this increase in the concentration of the blood must be associated with a great increase in its viscosity, and when that is combined with intense cold, with its accompanying constriction of all the smaller blood vessels, there are present all the conditions necessary for the production of frostbite. Therefore, acclimatization with all its benefits probably increases the risk of frostbite. Hence, one who is acclimatized must be especially careful of feet and hands and their coverings. It is hard to put on too many clothes at a great altitude, and very easy to put on too few. The chief point still remaining to be mentioned concerns the after effects of the climbing of Everest, but these varied so much that they give us little or no scientific information. Some of us were tired for 24 hours only, some for many days. Some were reported to have enlarged hearts, while in some the heart was normal. Some were incapacitated by frostbite, though their general physical condition was very probably good. One therefore cannot generalize about after effects, but as a medical man I feel strongly, by observation on myself and my companions on the expedition, that if one is to "live to fight another day," and to require the minimum recuperation period after an attempt on the mountain, it is essential during the attempt to keep oneself well within one's powers. One is tempted to go too hard, and to exert one's strength to its limits, but it is just the last few ounces of strength which call forth the greatest effort and make the maximum demands on one's resources, and if these resources are to be used to their full extent, they should be continuously conserved by an avoidance of definite hurry. Personally, I am of opinion that exercise before the climbing begins is of great value. Mallory and I were the only ones whom Longstaff allowed to make 2 attempts on Everest, and we were probably rendered fit in this way by the subsidiary expeditions we had made on the way to Mount Everest, and by our preliminary work in getting the camp ready on the North Col. It is, however, hard to generalize on a point like this, but each man knows the idiosyncrasies of his own constitution, and it should be left to individuals to a great extent to see that their condition on arrival at the foot of the mountain is the best that is possible. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors. Color in Tibet by T. Howard Somervell. In order to bring before the reader a vivid picture of Tibet, and especially of the region around Mount Everest, a comparison between Tibet and other better-known countries is almost inevitable. The expedition of 1922 took with them no official artist, or no doubt he would have been deputed to write this section of the book. There were, however, 2 people who tried to paint pictures of the country, Major Norton and myself. And though I realize how inadequate our efforts were, perhaps those of an official artist might have been almost as bad. However, as one who looks on the world with an eye for its beauty, although lacking the ability to transfer that beauty to canvas, one may perhaps be pardoned for endeavoring to describe certain general impressions of the scenery encountered by the expedition. In the course of our journey, we passed through a great variety of landscape. In Sikkim, for instance, we found a land of steep slopes and dense forests, while Tibet is almost a desert country. We experienced the clear air of the winter and the mists and storm clouds of the monsoon. While we were on the rolling plains of the Tibetan Plateau, only a few miles away were the snow-covered summits of the highest mountains in the world. Sikkim is in a country of deep valleys and of luxurious vegetation. The air is generally damp and the skies cloudy, and there is often a beautiful blue haze that gives atmosphere to the distance. Sikkim is not unlike the Italian side of the Alps in many ways. True, its scale is larger, and it possesses some of the most beautiful and impressive peaks in the world, for no alpine peak can vie with Siniolchum or Pandim for sheer beauty of form and surface. But on the whole the scenery of Sikkim is of the same general build as the valleys and peaks of northern Italy. In this sense Sikkim did not offer to the newcomer anything entirely different from what he had seen before. But Tibet and Everest certainly did, and the difference between Sikkim and Tibet is twofold. First, Tibet is almost uniformly over 13,000 feet above sea level, and therefore bears no trees at all. Second, Tibet is almost free from rainfall and is in consequence a desert country. One's eye traveled for mile after mile over red-brown sand and red-brown limestone hills, finally to rest on the blue and white of the distant snows. The air, before the monsoon commences, is almost always clear, clear to an extent unimagined by a European, clearer even than the air of an alpine winter. So peaks and ridges 30 or 40 miles away are often almost in the same visual plane as the foreground of the landscape. In some extensive views, such as we had from the hills above Tinkidzong, one came to look upon hills 30 miles away as the middle distance of one's picture, while the background was formed of mountains 100 miles from the point of view. It is this lack of atmosphere which makes pictorial representation of these Tibetan scenes so very difficult. The pictures I made on the course of the expedition have all had one criticism from many different people: there is no atmosphere. Many as are the demerits of these pictures, this is the one merit they have, and if they had an atmosphere they would cease to be truthful. In the Alps one has often seen mountains with extreme clearness at a great distance, but I never remember having viewed an alpine landscape in which there was practically no effect of distance, and practicably no blueness of the more distant shadows. Yet that is precisely what obtains in Tibet before the month of June. And then, with startling suddenness, comes the monsoon, with its damp air. For some months the landscape is entirely altered and also much beautified. The blue haze of the monsoon converts the distant shadows from their crude purple-brown to the most magnificent and sometimes brilliant blue. Once or twice one looked in vain on one's palette for a blue of sufficient brilliance and intensity to reproduce the color of the shadows 20 or 30 miles away. Then the monsoon brings clouds and rainstorms, all of which tend to give variety to the scene, and to endue the distant peaks with that effect of mystery which renders them so alluring and so beautiful. As far as the scenery among the higher mountains is concerned, the comparison of photographs of the Everest group of peaks with those of the Alps will give one more idea of the difference between the two districts than can a mere verbal description, save in the matter of scale and color. In color the Alps are more varied and the rock is, as a rule, a darker brown. The snow shadows are more blue and the outlines less clear, while alpine foregrounds so often contain trees which are totally absent from the foregrounds of Tibet. There, both rocks and stones, scree and valley bed are of a light reddish brown, almost uniform in tone from near foreground to extreme distance. Makalu, for example, is a colossal rock pyramid of quite a light ochre color. The rocks of Everest are of a light amber brown, relieved in the neighborhood of 27,000 feet by a lighter yellowish band of quartzite. The snow of the range on its northern side resembles that of alpine peaks, but on the southern face the festoons and grooves of ice, so well known to many from photographs of Himalayan mountains, decorate the much steeper and more uncompromising slopes. Most of the higher peaks are swept by continual gusts of wind which whirl clouds of snow from the topmost ridges into the sky. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors. Tibetan Culture by T. Howard Somerville. The Tibetans are a very simple folk, though not without a very definite civilization of their own. Art and music exist in all nations, if the art be merely the fashioning of utensils, and the music be the crudest of rhythms played on a tom-tom. Yet in Tibet, the rudimentary music and art associated with so many Eastern races is carried a stage farther, and what is in wilder people merely natural instinct has become in Tibet a definite culture. For I presume that culture is merely organized art, and certainly on that criterion the Tibetan is to some extent cultured. He is a fine architect, and many of his houses have a simple stateliness which raises them in artistic value high above the average dwelling house of most other Oriental countries, to say nothing of our own garden suburbs. The monasteries of Tibet are still more imposing, and some of them are real objects of beauty, for the dignified simplicity of the buildings themselves is combined with an elaborate and often beautiful decoration of windows and cornices. The Tibetans have learned the true principles of decoration. They do not cover the surfaces of their buildings with unnecessary ornament, but reserve the wooden parts alone for elaboration. The cornices are often intricate in workmanship, but throughout the great principle of design is carried to perfection, the principle that all ornament should be founded on utility. Thus, economy in the use of scrolls is combined with the multiplication of brackets, supports, and rafter ends, so that the whole is satisfying to the eye as being beautiful rather than useless. Considerable Chinese influence is shown in their decorative art, but the Tibetans have a personal, or rather national, touch which distinguishes their work in all branches of art from the Chinese. In painting, too, the influence of China and very occasionally of India is felt, though through it all the refined austerity of the better class Tibetan shines unmistakably. The older pictures, nearly always of sacred subjects, are drawn with consummate skill, colored with great taste, and in the matter of design rank much higher than the contemporary art of India. But alas, the story of painting in Tibet is the same as it is everywhere in this commercial world of ours. The modern Tibetan picture is worthless, careless, and meretricious. No doubt the demand for native art at the bazaars of Darjeeling and other places around has caused this deterioration of what was once a fine and noble art. Pictures which used to be the life work of devoted lamas and conscientious hermits are now dashed off to satisfy the capacious maw of the tasteless traveler. Though Tibet is still in measure the forbidden land, yet the tentacles of commercialism cannot but penetrate between its bars. And the same thing is now happening to Tibet as happened to Europe last century, and produced oleographs and official artists. It seems almost as if man by nature does bad work only when he is working for reward. This is a mere flashlight sketch of the art of Tibet, for details of which other books must be consulted. But the music of Tibet will be described more fully for two reasons. First, that no accurate record of it has to my knowledge been obtained until now, and second, that the writer is himself particularly fond of music, which he believes to be the highest of the arts. Just as in Europe today, we have both the traditional folk song and the highly organized orchestral music, so in Tibet both these forms of the art exist. The two are also more or less interdependent in Tibet, while in Western nations each often goes its own way without the other. The airs sung by the Tibetan people are usually simple, short, and oft repeated. They are nearly always in the pentatonic scale, represented best to the general reader by the black notes of the piano. Most isolated races evolved this scale at some time during their history, and the tunes of the Highlands of Scotland, the forests of Central Africa, the Appalachians of America, and the Tibetans are all in this scale. A typical well-known pentatonic tune is "Over the Sea to Sky." Those who know, for instance, the songs of the Western Highlands will be able to appreciate the cheerful and non-Oriental character of the tunes of Tibet, which are more akin to those of Russia and Eastern Europe than to the music of China or India. This general spirit of the music which the Tibetans play or sing points to a common origin of the folk tunes of Tibet and Russia. It seems probable that in Turkestan was the real origin of this music, which very likely spread eastwards into Tibet and westwards into Russia. Or if Turkestan is not the country of origin of the music, it may be the musical link between Russia and Tibet. The tunes of Nepal, as sung by our coolies, are many of them of a similar nature to those of Tibet, though more often the whole major or minor scale is used, giving them often a strangely European sound. Some of the Nepalese airs have a jolly lilt and swing, others in the minor key have quite a haunting beauty, and they too are quite unlike the music of the plains of India with its rather pointless wailing characteristics. In Tibet, then, the folk tunes are simple, short, and emphatically not such good tunes as the airs of Nepal. But, in addition to the songs of the peasants and beggars, there is the more highly organized and orchestrated music of the monasteries. This is usually played with three groups of instruments. First and foremost, the percussion, drums of all sizes from those made of a human skull to others 3 and 4 feet in diameter, and cymbals of great resonance and good tone, coming often from China. The cymbals are taken very seriously, and each different way of clashing them has a special name and a special religious significance. The hard-working percussion department keeps up a continuous rhythm throughout the performance of a devil dance or other musical festival, and to its strenuous and often sinister efforts are added from time to time the sounds of the two groups of wind instruments. The first of these, playing airs which often possess great charm, are the double reed oboes, about twice as long as our European oboe, and very often provided with equidistant holes, rendering them incapable of playing save in the scale of whole tones, or a close approximation to it. The second and larger wind instrument is the long straight trumpet, 8 to 12 feet long, of which the fundamental note is almost continuously blown. Most monasteries have two of these, about 1 tone apart in pitch, but as the longer of the two is blown so as to play its first overtone, while the fundamental note is played on the other, a drone bass of a minor seventh is the resulting sound. This adds to the sinister impressiveness of the music, and provides an effective accompaniment to the quaint tunes of the oboe-like instruments. At a devil dance performance, the orchestra plays for a whole day, or perhaps 2, almost without rest either for itself or for its listeners. In addition to these instruments, a fairly civilized violin is used in Tibet, especially by wandering beggar minstrels. This is about 2/3 as long as our violin and has 4 strings, tuned A-D, A-D in that order. The bow has 2 hanks of hair, one of which passes between the first and second strings, while the other goes between the third and fourth. Thus, by pressing the bow in one direction, the 2 A strings are sounded, producing a reinforced note, i.e. 2 notes in unison. By pressing the bow in the other direction, the sound of the D strings is obtained. The strings converge towards the top of the instrument so that they can all be fingered at once. The Tibetans become very agile with their fingers, and I have heard very skillful performances of rapid, jolly dance tunes by wandering minstrels. These tunes, like the songs of the peasants, are usually in the pentatonic scale. One more instrument must be mentioned. the trumpet made from a human thigh bone. This is not very commonly used in the larger monasteries, but occasionally sounds a note in the ritual of the worship of smaller villages. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of the Assault on Mount Everest, 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by bridgerecording.com. The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors. Natural History by Dr. T.G. Longstaff. Previous experience of the conditions of Tibetan travel had taught me that the collection and observation was a task requiring complete immunity from other duties. But to the doctor of such an expedition, this condition was not attainable. In the collection of specimens, we were, however, fortunate in obtaining the assistance of several other members of the expedition. But it is especially to Major Norton that the thanks of the Everest Committee are due. For in addition to his other duties, he took over the whole of the botanical work and worked equally with myself in all other branches of zoology. His gift of painting was particularly valuable in leading to the certain identification of birds in districts where collecting was prohibited. At the time of writing, he is on duty at Shinak, and the following notes lose half their value through the lack of his promised collaboration, which I had anticipated with particular pleasure. In his absence, I must omit all reference to botany, for personally, owing to the wintry conditions during our outward march and to the speed of my journey back with the invalids, I saw nothing that has not been already better described by Wollaston. But Norton, with our Lepcha collector Rumu, obtained some 350 flowering plants in Karta, and we also sent back samples of agricultural seeds. It must be remembered that it was the constant aim of General Bruce to render it easier for any subsequent party to pass through the country. The objection of the Tibetans to the taking of any life is almost universal amongst the clerics and is devoutly shared by the lay population in certain localities. These considerations unfortunately applied particularly to the districts of Tindiki, Sheltsarzong, and Rombuk, where the killing of even domestic animals is prohibited. There are, however, other parts of Tibet where the same restraint is unnecessary, and even where hunting is habitually practiced by the semi-nomadic population. This immunity, in our case, applied especially to the Chumbi Valley and the country around Fari, and in consequence, we have been able to bring back some material which it is hoped will add to the value of the larger collections brought back last year by Dr. Wollaston. That portion of Tibet visited by the expedition, and indeed it is typical of most of its provinces, is a region of bare uplands and naked mountains. Such physical conditions combine with a violent type of radiation in the thin, dry air to evolve a daily strife of winds, ceaselessly seeking to rectify the balance of atmospheric stability. This continual wind is indeed the foundation of the traveler's discomfort and the worst enemy of the mountaineer. Owing to its aridity, due to the intervention of the rain-catching Himalaya, the country is practically treeless. Distant open views prevail over vast landscapes, lit by strong lights in an atmosphere devoid of fogs or softening mist effects. Usually, nothing can move without being visible from a great distance. Hence, though it is not a region particularly rich in life, yet those forms which do prevail are not easily overlooked. Concealment is only to be obtained by burrowing underground or by immobility combined with protective coloration. Nowhere is this more obtrusively shown than on the great stony uplands, at an altitude of from 14,000 to 17,000 feet east and south of Kamazong. Here we were in constant sight of bands of wild asses, gazelle, and sheep. From a distance of a couple miles, a prowling wolf was easily discerned, and the ground is nowhere here covered by a continuous carpet of grass or herbs, but each plant is several yards from the next. Hence, even a small herd of game will cover the ground with innumerable tracks. suggesting to the uninitiated a far greater number of individuals than really exist. To watch a flock of Tibetan sheep or goats grazing seems like watching a migration, for the herd moves at a smart walk, often breaking into a run, each individual racing for the next mouthful a few yards ahead. They move on a wide front, with the shepherd and his wolf dog well in evidence. On one occasion, we came on a wolf devouring a lamb. 50 yards away lay the guardian dog, waiting apparently for any scraps the robber might leave. It might be supposed that as in the Arctic, the birds and animals would turn white in winter, but two sufficient reasons against this necessity have already been indicated. Firstly, the snow line is so high, probably between 19,000 and 20,000 feet, that vegetation does not extend up to it. Even the predatory beasts are dependent on vegetation for the pasture of their prey. Secondly, evaporation is so rapid that the country is never snow-clad for long, even during the winter season. But some modification of habit to meet the hostility of winter under conditions of life already so severe is to be looked for. Of marmots, we saw nothing during the journey to Everest. Probably they were still hibernating. Norton found them later in Karta and obtained a welcome specimen, yet hares were very common at 16,000 and 17,000 feet, several haunting the old moraines of the Rongbuk Glacier even above our base camp. Here also, at 17,000 feet, was a small herd of beryl, or blue sheep, which, having some familiarity with the hermit monks, permitted a fairly close approach. More interestingly are the mouse hares, or pikas, of several varieties, small friendly creatures which live in colonies, mainly on the open plains, where even their small burrows sometimes undermine considerable areas so that one must ride with care. They are quick and lively in their movements, darting from hole to hole with extreme rapidity and peeping from their burrows at the stranger with obvious amusement. They are often first seen sitting up on their hind legs. They lay in stores of grass for winter use. Though the evidence all goes to prove that they do not regularly hibernate, they frequently utter a nearly inaudible, high-pitched whispering call, a sort of subdued whistle, from which no doubt comes the Botia name of Shippy, the Whisperer, which I obtained in Nari Corsum in 1905. Certain birds, as will be subsequently noted, live in association with these small rodents, and, add a further note to the charm of their colonies. It appears impossible to trap them, and as their skulls are usually damaged by shooting, a good series of skins in both summer and winter pelage of the different species is still much wanted for study in our museums. The collection of small animals is always difficult, and under the circumstances already detailed, our collection of skins was necessarily a very small one. Geoffrey Bruce, however, obtained a perfect specimen of the panda from the forest on the Chumbi side of the Gel Blas. This curiously aberrant animal, sometimes called the bear cat, is about the size of a fox and has a rich, thick fur of a chestnut color on the back, black below, and with thick, bushy, ring-marked tail. In appearance, it resembles somewhat the badgers, the bears, and the cats. Its relative, the great panda of Tibet, is one of the rarest of large animals, owing to its very circumscribed distribution. A hamster and a few pecas of 3 varieties were caught at night in our tents. A weasel shot in Sikkim and another weasel and marmot from Karta complete our list of mammal skins. We are much disappointed at our failure to see or obtain any specimens from 20,000 feet, where Wollaston's pika was actually handled last year, the greatest known altitude for resident mammals. As to the birds, we were fortunate in having been able to go over Dr. Wollaston's collection with Mr. Norman B. Kinnear of the Natural History Museum, who provided us in addition with a series of careful notes by which we could identify those likely to be met within localities where we could not shoot. It is hoped that our material will be found sufficient for Mr. Kinnear to publish a supplement to his recent paper in the Ibis on last year's collection. Dr. Percy R. Lowe keeper of birds of the Natural History Museum, was particularly anxious for us to obtain for him a specimen of the Himalayan or ibis-billed curlew in the flesh, for purposes of dissection, nothing being known of its anatomy up to the present. Luckily, this bird haunts the Chumbi Valley, and Norton and I were able to spend a day in its pursuit. It is of the form of a small curlew, of a general French gray hue, with bold dark markings and a coral red beak and legs. There were several of these birds, not yet paired, about Yatung in the Chumbi Valley, but they were very wary. They utter a high-pitched wader-like note, not at all resembling our curlew. They always flew directly over the main river, whence we never could have retrieved them. The shores of this river are fringed by beaches of large round gray pebbles, and resting amongst these the birds were invisible. Eventually I lay up under the bank, and Norton succeeded in driving a bird onto an island in midstream, where I shot it. With an outward display of truly scientific eagerness, we divested ourselves of our nether garments and waded waist deep through the torrent. We came near quarreling as to whether the water or the air was the coldest. But at any rate, we retrieved our bird, and what is more, duly preserved it in spirits through all the trials of travel and climate, safely back to Dr. Lowe. In the Chumbi Valley, also we obtained the great or solitary snipe, an addition to last year's list. But our favorite family, the redstarts, were the most interesting. The beautiful white-capped redstart, most widely distributed in the Himalaya, was still with us. The plumbous redstart and the blue-fronted redstart we had already obtained in Sikkim. These also were present at the beginning of April in the Chumbi Valley. We obtained in addition the beautiful blue-tail or red-flanked bush robin. I understand that the three latter species have not been previously recorded from this locality. The blue-tail frequents dense bushes over marshy spots and is very quiet and furtive in its habits, while the redstarts are the most obtrusive of birds. As to me, they are one of the most beautiful of families. At Fari, I luckily obtained a specimen of what I thought was the Indian redstart, but the bird in the hand proved again to be the blue-fronted sort. At 17,000 feet above the base camp, over the snout of the main Rongbuk Glacier, I saw a cockbird of Guldenstein's redstart. Fortunately, a very easily recognizable bird, and one I had previously seen in Nubra and in the Karakoram country. Although I had previously become somewhat familiar with bird life in Tibet, I was not prepared to see the teeming flocks of finches, buntings, and larks, which we met with the bare stony uplands at every old camping ground or village we encountered. A portion of this swarming bird population appears to have been due to the spring migration being at its height. Of this we had evidence before enduring our passage of the Gelap La from Sikkim into the Chumbi Valley. At Fari, and at Kamazong especially, the birds appeared not yet to have dispersed in pairs to their breeding territory, but, though actually arrived at their destination, to be still collected in migration flocks. Yet, this condition of things may be more apparent than real, for neither Norton nor I ever managed to find any evidence of nesting behavior in such an extremely common bird as Brandt's ground linnet. It is conceivable that the inimical climatic conditions of Tibet are such as to condemn a larger portion than usual of the bird population to a celibate existence, a condition which is at least by no means rare even in the British Isles. A small piece of evidence is that only 4 nests of larks and wagtails which I found contained only 3 eggs each, as if the altitude had reduced the number of eggs laid. It is to be noted that in each case the eggs were incubated, and so the clutches were presumably complete. But, as an exception to this rule, at Chushar on June 13, I found a nest of the eastern desert wheatear, with a normal clutch of 5 eggs. In writing of nesting, it may be recorded that we obtained the eggs of the Tibetan snowcock from nearly 17,000 feet on the Pong La. At the base camp, a brown accentor commenced building its nest in a crevice between a stack of provision boxes in the middle of the camp on May 16. Laying did not commence till May 25th, a long period of delay, and was completed with the 3rd egg on the 27th. The hen, commenced to sit at once, and no more eggs were laid. Norton observed alpine chows and rock doves nesting in the cliffs above the base camp at an altitude of 17,000 feet. Besides the usual ravens and species already named, the base camp was visited by Brandt's ground linnet, a sparrow, a snowfinch, the ground chow, and the shore lark. Noel, during his vigil on the Chang La, saw a bird fly above him, borne to the westerly gate, but Wollaston's Lammergeier maintained still the first place in altitude with a record of over 24,000 feet. At Trang So Chumbab on June 11th, I had the opportunity of observing the habits of Blandford's mountain finch. This bird seemed to live in amity with the pikas in their burrows. I marked the birds bringing food to a pika burrow, and wishing to see the young in down were like, Finch and I commenced to dig out the hole. It proved, however, beyond our powers in the sun-baked ground. So I fell to watching again. We had laid open the burrow for about 2 feet. The hen bird at once returned with food and alighted at the spot where the burrow formerly commenced. Began immediately to tunnel into the ground, quite oblivious of the true opening in full view only 2 feet away. What would our nature writer say to such a lapse of intellect? The bird burrowed with its beak, diving its head into the ground and boring with a very rapid jerky twist so that the sand was scattered in a small cloud. This was repeated several times and on several visits. I then filled up the trench, leaving the nesting hole open. On the next visit, the bird flew down the hole, which I then stopped with loose earth. In the morning, the burrow had been completely cleared and the birds were busily feeding their young again. This seems to point to the conclusion that these birds are naturally ground dwellers and are fully capable of making their own tunnels, but that the abundance of pika burrows has induced lazy habits. Mandel's snowfinch, not obtained by last year's expedition, was shot by us at Pika's warrens at Fari, and seen always associated with pikas on the following days. On June 11th, also we were witnesses to what must be a common tragedy. A family of small Brahmini ducklings, the ruddy sheldrake of Europe, were making their noisy way down from some nesting site on the steppe to our headwaters of the Arun in safety. The parents may have taken fright at our camp, through which the ducklings scuttled fearlessly. The loathsome ravens gathered, as always, for carrion or camp refuse, swooped down and attacked the hapless family, bolting a whole duckling at each mouthful. Surely a gun would have done no harm here. Norton made an interesting discovery that the meadow bunting breeds in the Kama Valley, thus extending its breeding range far to the south. It may indeed be expected that several species now believed to breed only in Siberia may in fact be found nesting on the northern slopes of the Himalaya, and even in other highland regions of Tibet, for here altitude comes to the assistance of latitude to produce an Arctic type of climate, flora, and fauna, though it must be admitted that the aridity of Tibet must produce very different climatic conditions to those obtaining in the far north. In Nari Korsum, 400 miles west of Everest, I had obtained specimens with young in down of the large eastern sand plover, which previously was only known as a breeding species from much farther north. And again, the day we left Tibet at 17,000 feet on the Serpa La, I found another pair of these dotterel from their behavior obviously nesting, so to speak, at the very gates of India. For 10 miles further on, we had left everything Tibetan behind us. Landscape, flowers, birds, beasts, and insects were all different. Nowhere else in the world can there be a sharper natural division between the Tibetan highlands and the true Himalayan zone. The physical and climatic conditions prevailing in this part of Tibet produces an environment hostile to reptilian and amphibian life. The single toad obtained last year was quite new to science, and Norton's capture of a second specimen is a great piece of luck. Miss Joan B. Proctor, FZS, of Natural History Museum, has described and named it. It is remarkable by having the toes fully webbed. She also writes that the toad, together with the frog and lizard, were all devoid of external ears, the tympanum itself being absent in the toad. This unusual modification is attributed to the effect of altitude, but it has also been suggested that the absence of ears is due to inherited atrophy following generations of frostbite, an interesting subject for the followers of Weissman. The fish, rejoicing in the name Schizopygopsis stolitska, is stated by Mr. Norman never to have been previously obtained at such an altitude. With the mollusk we drew blank, in spite of Norton's energetic dredging of tarns and pools at Carta, nor did any member of the expedition produce a single snail shell, though all were armed with pillboxes and on the lookout for them. It is probably only among the various families of insects that any important biological results may be hoped for from this expedition. Our collection from the base camp, greatly due to the assistance received from Morris of more than 300 beetles of a dozen or more species, may be sufficient to show some evidence of the effect of environment. A number of them are new to science, and, with one or two exceptions, were not obtained last year. There are already described over 100,000 kinds of beetles, and under these circumstances, it is obvious that even such a modest collection as ours will take some time to work out. Mr. K. G. Blair of the Natural History Museum has it in hand, and with the assistance of Mr. H. E. Andrews and Dr. G. A. K. Marshall, will certainly make the most of it. His preliminary note gives 160 specimens of 4 or perhaps 5 kinds of ground beetles, belonging to the genera of Palearctic distribution. Of the tenebronids, there are 140 specimens belong to 6 species, probably all new, but characteristic of the mountainous region of Central Asia. Of the weevils, there are only 17 specimens, but they appear to belong to 7 new species. 2 of these were kindly collected by Norton's toad. Mr. B. P. Uvarov is working out the Orthoptera and writes that our stick insect is of great interest because the family is essentially a subtropical group and has never been recorded from such high altitude before. We were lucky also in getting 3 more specimens of Wollaston's curious new grasshopper. At the same time, my old specimens from Parong have been elevated into the type of a new species of a new genus. Future visitors are earnestly requested to collect every grasshopper-like insect they meet here, for the orthopterous fauna of High Asia is wholly unexplored. It must be remembered that we constantly pass through localities in which it was inadvisable to show even a butterfly net. When recrossing the Pang La, I lagged behind and spent a laborious hour collecting disconcertingly quick-flying, woolly-bodied flies. These and others are being worked out by Major E. E. Austin, DSO. There is also a burrowing bee, the most interesting insect I met. It is of the repellent, ant-like aspect, of an evil black and red pattern. It flies astonishingly fast, and can only be netted by careful stalking when it lands to burrow in the sand. It is preparing a tomb for a paralyzed grub in which it will lay its own egg. On hatching, the bee grub will feed on the living corpse of its entertainer. I first observed it by noticing. As I rode along the banks of the Feng Chu, tiny jets of sand being shot violently upward from the ground, the insect itself being quite invisible. My pony, a true Tibetan, loathed the sight of a butterfly net. I had no companion to hold him, and the pursuit of science was attended by more than the usual trials. A series of small moths was obtained at the base camp, and Norton collected more in Carta. These are being worked out by Mr. W. H. T. Tams, but in case of moths, identification is a particularly lengthy and laborious business. The butterflies are naturally few in such an environment, nor does the constant wind make their breathless capture any easier. Captain Indy Riley is working them out, and tells me that in general they resemble our English butterflies, with other alpine families. On a recent visit to the museum, I was excusing the scantiness of our collection, explaining as a rule I had only been able to collect while crossing high passes, indicating a series of small dark brown ringlets, rather the worse for wear. I said that was all I saw above 16,000 feet. Why that, said Riley, is a new species of a new genus. So may our successor seize every opportunity that offers of collecting even the least and most inconspicuous looking insects, in the endeavor to assist our research workers in adding some particle to the sum of our knowledge of nature. End of chapter 15. Recording by bridgerecording.com. End of The Assault on Mount Everest, 1922, by various authors.